Good morning, everyone. Call to order this public hearing of the Assassination Records Review Board. I want to welcome everyone here today to this public hearing in Los Angeles. We're very pleased as a review board to be here and very pleased that you were able to join us this morning. The Assassination Records Review Board is an independent federal agency that was established by the Congress for a very important purpose. That purpose being to identify and secure for the American people all of the materials and documentation concerning the tragic assassination of President John F. Kennedy 33 years ago in Dallas. The objective is to provide for the American people a complete public record of this national tragedy and to lift the veil of secrecy that has surrounded the records of the assassination for so many years, and to present files that are fully accessible to any American citizen who wishes to see them, who wishes to study them, and to try to understand. The members of the Review Board, which is a part-time citizens panel, were appointed by President Clinton. To my right on the end is Dr. William Joyce, the Associate Librarian at Princeton University. And to my immediate right is Dr. Anna Nelson, Professor of History at American University in Washington, D.C. To my left, Dr. Kermit Hall, who is the Dean of the College of Humanities at Ohio State University. Dr. Henry Graff, Professor Emeritus of History at Columbia University, was unable to be with us today. He's the fifth member of the board. My name is John Thunheim. I'm the chair of the Assassination Records Review Board, and I am a United States District Court judge in the state of Minnesota. Also with us up here today is the executive director of the Review Board, the top staff member for the effort, David Marwell. We have a number of other staff members who are with us today: Jeremy Gunn, Tom Samolick, Tracy Shykoff, and Eileen Sullivan. I must emphasize before we begin today that it is not the mandate of the Review Board to reinvestigate the assassination and to try to determine the answers to all of the mysteries and questions that are still swirling around this event. The Review Board is, however, on a search for records. Our primary focus has been, as it should be, a review and release of federal government records, records that have been held by agencies of the federal government for the past 30-some years. But the Review Board is also seeking records, documents, photographs, and other materials, whatever form they may be in, that will enable the American public to see the complete record of the death of their president and its aftermath. We are nearing the end of our second year in existence, and we have made significant progress. We've issued rulings on close to 2,500 records, federal records, and another 2,300 or 2,400 are in the category of consent releases by the agencies following our rulings on similar issues. Those add to a collection that is growing by the day at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Later in our hearing, we'll hear from Steve Tilley, who is our liaison at the National Archives. He will bring us up to date on the current status of the collection. The Review Board has nearly completed its review of the Central Intelligence Agency's core file on the assassination, the Oswald 201 file. We're nearing completion of review of the core files maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation on the assassination, and have made significant progress at this stage on the records that were maintained by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which investigated the assassination in the late 1970s. We have secured now much of the record of the Jim Garrison saga in New Orleans, the only criminal prosecution that was taken involving the assassination. Other private parties have made significant contributions to the board, to the collection, to the American public, including new films that have been recently discovered from the day of the assassination. We've made significant new progress recently on military records, including the NSA, for which we hope to have announcements very soon regarding the release of those records. And we've made significant attempts to try to clarify the medical evidence, one of the more enduring of the mysteries surrounding the assassination. We hope to release materials concerning the medical evidence somewhere around the end of this year. Much progress has been made by the Review Board and its staff thus far, but there is still much to be done, and that is why we're here today in Los Angeles. We're going to hear testimony today from a number of experts, individuals who we believe will greatly assist the board in its search for records. Many more individuals have indicated an interest in testifying today. We simply don't have time to accommodate everyone. We thank them for their interest. We hope that those who are not able to testify today will provide the review board with written testimony and information that will be able to assist the board. The board has held previous hearings in Dallas, in Washington, in Boston, and New Orleans, and those hearings have been extraordinarily helpful to the board as it's gone through its work over the past 2 years. And although the review board's review of classified records must, by necessity, occur in private, out of the public eye, the board does feel strongly that ongoing reports of the work of the review board should be as public as possible. The public hearings have given us an opportunity to hear from the public and to be able to adjust our work in response to legitimate interests that have been expressed to us by members of the public. Before we hear our first witness this morning in Los Angeles, we have one matter of business that we'd like to take care of as a board, and that has to do with the extension of our existence for an additional year. When Congress passed the original law, the President John F. Kennedy Records Collection Act of 1982, they specified the review board was to be in existence for a period of 2 years, with a third year at the board's discretion. When the act was repassed several years later to give us additional time because of the slow startup, that provision was also contained in the new act. The board has made a determination that it's important to continue this effort for an additional year, and so we need to go about our business of doing that. Dr. Hall?
Well, pursuant to Section 701 of the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act, I move the Review Board extend its life for one additional year to October 1, 1997.
Is there a second?
Second.
Been moved and seconded that the Review Board extend its existence for one additional year until October 1 of 1997. All in favor of that motion say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It's carried. Again, I want to thank all of you for your interest today, and now we are going to move on and hear from our first witness. Our first witness today is Robert Tanenbaum. He is a former deputy counsel for the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 1970s. He is the author of Corruption of Blood, a fictionalized account of his experience with the committee investigating the assassination of President Kennedy. Mr. Tanenbaum, welcome.
Good morning. You look at me in stunned silence. I'm here at the request of you to answer questions, and if you have any, I'd be delighted to answer them. I purposely avoided not giving you a statement because I'm not here to urge you to do anything other than to release every document you can get your hands on. I could tell you that if Richard Sprague and I stayed with the committee, there was no document that we would have kept away from the American people. And when I say document, I include in that films or other pieces of evidentiary value. We saw nothing, frankly, that should not be given to the American people. And I say that, Judge and members of the panel, when you mentioned classified material. we were representing at the time an investigation of the legislative branch of government. We looked into certain executive intelligence agency activity of the executive branch, and we did not feel that any of that material, certainly none of it should have been redacted, and the material we were looking for, particularly from the executive intelligence agencies, were reports of the homicides, those two homicides of two extraordinary Americans. But the focus was to deal with these cases as homicides.
Well, would it be possible, Mr. Tanenbaum, for you to give us really just a kind of brief overview of your career and how you came to be involved with the House Select Committee on Assassinations?
I attended college and law school at the University of California at Berkeley and went to work for District Attorney Frank Hogan in New York County. And while there, I served as Bureau Chief of the Criminal Courts of the Felony Trial Bureau and Deputy Chief and for a period of time Acting Chief of the Homicide Bureau. And while there, tried several hundred cases to verdict. And while I was there, I was asked to come down to the committee. I didn't apply for it in any fashion. And Richard Sprague was the chief counsel, and I met with members of the committee and Mr. Sprague, both at Mr. Sprague's office in Philadelphia and in Washington. I had no real intimate knowledge of the library of books that had been written to that point on the assassination, and wanted assurance from the committee simply that whatever the facts were, we would be permitted to tell the American people. And that is, if Oswald did it from the facts and he did it alone, we were prepared to say that. If he didn't, based upon the evidence, we too wanted the ability to say that. And we wanted to have an open and clear investigation, as we did, for example, in dealing with homicides on the streets of Manhattan. And again, I emphasize that because, of course, we're dealing with two extraordinary Americans, that is Dr. Martin Luther King and President Kennedy, but the cases were to be analyzed by individuals who had a lot of experience trying homicides. And that's how I came to be at the committee. Thereafter, I've been in private practice and have written 10 books, all of which are based upon my own experiences as a assistant district attorney and otherwise in the legal profession.
Can you help us to understand a little bit about the nature of your responsibilities in your work for HSCA and how long you were there?
I started on or about the first week of December 1976 and remained to a period of time, as I best can recall, in the summer of 1977. I was responsible and was chief counsel, in essence, to the subcommittee investigating the assassination of President Kennedy, although deputy chief to the whole committee investigating both homicides. And the organization was broken down into the Kennedy side and the King side. I had with me, fortunately, expert detectives, some of whom I'd worked with in New York County, who had been detectives for 20 to 30 years just dealing with homicides. And during that time, the focus of our investigation that was most fruitful had to deal with the anti-Castro-Cuban CIA connection to the assassination. And that is to say, briefly, we tried to deal with documentary evidence rather than with individuals who are now coming forward in 1976-77 who might allege that they saw acts in 1963 they didn't bother to tell anybody about for 13 or 14 years. And some of those documents and material that we had was somewhat shocking to me, having been in law enforcement as a DA. And that is to say, when I came across, for example, executive committee transcript, and that was, and bear with me, I'm going back approximately 20 years, 19 years in this, and it's not something I think about on an everyday basis. Although I'm troubled by what happened in Washington, frankly, and that is to say that the Congress really wasn't interested in pursuing the truth, which is why Richard Sprague and I left. But, and I'll get to that in a direct response to a question, but with respect to the investigation, the executive committee transcript, for example, of approximately January 20th, 23rd, 27th, in that period of time, when the Attorney General of Texas, Wagner Carr, Henry Wade, the district attorney, and Leon Jaworski, counsel to the Attorney General, on the transcript spoke to the Chief Justice and said in substance, as I recall, that they had information from unimpeachable sources that Lee Harvey Oswald was a contract employee of the CIA and the FBI. And the Chief Justice said, well, we'll investigate that. And again, in substance on the record, Alan Dulles says, not so fast. And what do you mean, says the Chief Justice? To which Alan Dulles replies, well, if you ask J. Edgar Hoover whether or not Oswald was an employee of the FBI, he's simply going to say no. To which the Chief Justice responded, well, you mean to tell me if I were to call an agent in here, under oath, he would not tell the truth? And Dulles said, if he were a good agent. And the Chief Justice said, well, who will he tell the truth to? And Dulles replied, maybe the President. Coming again from the office of Frank Hogan, which from my experience was an apolitical meritocracy, I was stunned with that kind of revelation. That was, one of many. I was also stunned and sadly disappointed when David Phillips gave testimony before the committee in executive session and, in fact, lied to the committee. He told the committee that on or about October 1st, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald went to Mexico City, and that in Mexico City went to the Russian embassy and telephoned the Cuban embassy, and that photographs of him were taken, and there was a tape recording of that conversation. We found out, bottom line, that the photographic equipment had broken down, he indicated, so that the wrong photograph of Oswald with the wrong description on the telex of Oswald's alleged appearance in Mexico City was sent out through the executive intelligence agencies and otherwise, and so they didn't have the real photograph. He also, importantly, misled the committee by saying that the tape of that telephone conversation was destroyed, and in the ordinary course he said they were destroyed every 6 or 7 days. I imagine they did that for purposes of economy. I'm not quite sure, or recycled them. I don't know what he meant by that, but we of course then came up with a document that was dated November 23rd from J. Edgar Hoover, indicating that the agents who had investigated the case and had spoken to Oswald for approximately 17 hours had listened to the October 1st tape in Mexico City of an individual who identified himself as Lee Harvey Oswald in the Russian embassy calling the Cuban embassy, and these agents stated that the voice on the tape is not the voice of Lee Harvey Oswald. The Antonio Vesciano material on Alpha 66 and the anti-Castro Cuban activity with this Maurice Bishop, who, from the evidence we had at the committee, was David Phillips. That was in our judgment based upon the information we had, was somewhat shocking in that, according to Vesciano, unsolicited basically, he was telling our investigators that, in fact, he, with Maurice Bishop, David Phillips, was with Lee Harvey Oswald. We had photographs of Oswald with Clay Shaw and David Ferry. We had information of Oswald being in Clinton, Louisiana, with Ferry, and other rabid anti-Castro Cuban individuals and various soldiers of fortune types who were contract employees of the CIA. We came across a film of anti-Castro Cubans who were identified as anti-Castro Cubans, not on the film, but people who we recognized, and these soldiers of fortune types who were the contract employees, CIA, the Sturgises, the Hemmings, and other individuals. Again, it was somewhat shocking to me because I learned at PS 238 in Brooklyn when I was at public school that there was the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard. I didn't know about any secret armies that were existing in America. We came across some material from Earl Warren, I think was probably the most troubling to me, and that was his point of view to his staff that existing conditions were going to override principle in this case. I had the greatest respect, still do, for Earl Warren as a great Chief Justice, and he had a remarkable career here in California. both as district attorney, I should say all as district attorney in Alameda County, and of course as attorney general and governor. But I guess it was best summed up almost 3 years ago when I appeared for the first time at the 30-year anniversary at a convocation in Chicago where I was on a panel with Mr. Burt Griffin, who is a judge now, I believe, in Ohio, who was one of the counsel for the Warren Commission. And he indicated that we, that is some of the counsel, when he said we, to the Warren Commission, didn't really trust our investigators, the CIA and FBI people, but we wanted to keep them close to us because we had nobody else to rely on. And the troubling aspect, of course, in all this is that there can be no compromise. There was no compromise from our point of view with respect to the investigation of this case. We held no brief for either side or any point of view other than where the facts were leading us, period. And when it became clear that we had to recall David Phillips to the committee, when it became clear that we had to probe into this area that burst forward like ripe peaches falling from trees of the CIA's involvement with anti-Castro Cubans and Lee Harvey Oswald, where the committee almost shut us down virtually. That is to say, we could no longer make long-distance telephone calls. We had franking privilege removed. But fortunately, I had two people in the field, Al Gonzalez, who was an outstanding detective for many, many years, in the 20s, perhaps 30s, I forget, I can't recall exactly, in New York as a homicide detective, and another investigator, Gaten Fonzie, who had worked for the Church Committee and was working in Florida, in the Miami area, and they were able to give us a lot of information. So I was, in that regard, I was somewhat stunned, having, as I said, represented the people in New York County, and somewhat shocked again to see documents I didn't mention from Richard Helms indicating that he was stonewalling the Warren Commission to his people. They'll forget about things. They won't remember when we ask them for it. Don't give it right away. Judges, I know you must have dealt with in some of these cases where you have the arguments on discovery and material that's not given over and given over late. But what we're talking about here is not one isolated case. We're talking here about the mirror of America's conscience, and that mirror did not reflect the kind of truth that we care about as Americans. So to me, it's always been an American issue. And the reason why I say that the Congress was not interested in this, to the extent that when I say this, I mean to say finding the truth in this case, is that there is no political way to investigate a case. There's no Republican, Democratic way to analyze evidence. So in the compromise of what the Congress does, as it was designed by the Constitution, you can't compromise on a criminal investigation. That is to say, it's okay if we tell the American people 70% of the truth, but they can't handle the other 30%. And that gets me back to what His Honor said with respect to classified material. I don't believe that, and this is from my own experience, and when I was, during a period of time running the Homicide Bureau in New York County, I was responsible for thousands of homicides, regrettably, that occurred on the streets of Manhattan on a yearly basis. That some people, I don't believe, are injected with gold in their veins and stamp a document top secret, secret, or otherwise, and therefore it should remain that way in perpetuity, and we poor John Doe Americans are unable to look at them. Not with the track record, I will say, with respect to those individuals at that time who were in the executive intelligence agencies, with that record of deceit and deception. It is a sad commentary, and it's heartbreaking for me to have seen it. And it's the primary reason why Richard Sprague and I left. And the reason was I wanted the committee to go forward. We didn't want to shut anything down and have a grandstand play with respect to what our opinions were. I don't believe I have a monopoly on the knowledge of what happened here. I don't know what happened. I do know that I don't think, from my experience, Lee Harvey Oswald could be convicted in any courtroom in America. That's not saying much. O.J. Simpson wasn't convicted with a lot of evidence, but the fact is, based upon a lot of the problems in this case, starting from eyewitness testimony and right down the line, I wouldn't want to be the DA to have to explain this to a jury. So the integrity of the evidence is in question. But I was heartbroken, am heartbroken that these events occurred by our government. And I'm hopeful that in some fashion, whatever is left of these records will be released, because when a former Secretary of Defense testifies, or rather writes a book, and keep in mind, my book, Corruption of Blood, that's mentioned in these papers, is a novel, is a work of fiction. Unfortunately, we on the committee who are investigating this case found the Warren Commission report to be a piece of fiction, and wasn't meant to be. But when I read a book about the former Secretary of Defense saying that he lied to the United States Senate about whether or not America should go to war, and I reflect upon an individual who I happen to see, his name is Fuller, whose father is Chesty Fuller, and this young man represents to me the lying of individuals in government and the distortion of American history and the results that flow therefrom. He, as you may know, wrote a Pulitzer Prize book about his experience. He stepped on a mine when he was in Vietnam, and he was there for about 5 to 8 weeks in that period, and he lost his limbs. He had no legs, and his hands were virtually blown apart. A couple of years ago, he took his life. He represents those 59,000 who died, 500,000 or so who were in hospitals. The reason I mention that is, if we had the justification to pursue a war, then we should have told the American people what that was. If in fact we had a report that told us what the truth was about the assassination of President Kennedy, then our government had a direct responsibility to tell the American people what the truth was. And if they didn't find that it was Lee Harvey Oswald, but they could have told us where they were in the process of what they were doing, from my point of view, as one humble American, I certainly would have been satisfied with that accurate historical record. But I wasn't going to participate any longer when I found out that the Congress was not going to tell the truth. I didn't want to participate in a historical fraud. And as I have mentioned on occasion publicly, my daughter, when I was in Washington, was 3 years old. She's now a junior at UCLA. And I didn't want to look at her years later and put my rubber stamp on a report that I knew was a fraud because it would look good for my resume, and then maybe I can get another job as a counsel somewhere and do a teach somewhere at a university, as has taken place on occasion. But it was more important to me then, it's more important to me now, not to do what's right for the resume, but to deal with the truth. So that's a long-winded answer to a question. I apologize for it.
With respect to records, part of the collection of the House Select Committee on Assassinations that you played a role in developing, are there other records or groups of records that you recall that perhaps were not put into the collection that we can be looking for? Any ideas for us?
Well, the only area that was of value to us was this anti-Castro Cuban CIA connection. And there were a lot of records with respect to Antonio Vesciano, who had formed Alpha 66 with the help of Bishop Phillips, and the whole connection of Oswald with the intelligence community. That was the prime area. Where they are today, of course, I have no idea. And where they were put when I left, I also have no idea. But they were there when I left.
I'm interested in your point of view on what should be closed and what should be open, because you know, of course, we have a broad mandate to open, and we've done all that we possibly can to do that. And many of the documents that you saw that were restricted are in the archives now and are open to the public. But I wonder if you were at all troubled, because this has been raised for us to decide, wondered if you've been troubled by privacy interests in these documents. That's a little bit different issue, but one which also faces us as we decide on opening documents.
I wasn't looking for the disclosure aspect while we were in Washington. With respect to anything having to do with personnel, having to do with backgrounds of individuals who were investigators that weren't relevant to what in fact was being investigated. What I'm talking about are the standard investigative forms of what individual from the government spoke to whom and what was said, and when it was said, and what if any follow-up was made. As in the ordinary course you do in an investigation. If you take over a homicide investigation in any city in America, you look at police reports, unredacted. And that's the manner in which we wanted those documents. We weren't interested in sources and methods or embarrassing any individuals. That's the last thing we wanted to do. All we wanted was what was the information that was given with respect to a whole range of issues. Some of those issues, frankly, were the issues of individuals who were at the grassy knoll area, running away, one called back by an officer, and an individual was running out of the depository shortly after the shots were fired, who had Secret Service identification, and in fact the Secret Service didn't know who they were, because all the Secret Service agents in Dallas at the time were in the motorcade. There are areas that are very, very prime for disclosure, and again, I have to repeat, I saw nothing when I was in Washington that would cause me not to turn over in its entirety the material that I'm referring to. For example, the Helms documents, the executive committee transcripts, the material from the FBI, whether it was from the director, Mr. Hoover, to supervisorial personnel or otherwise, having to do with this case, it seems to me, and for example, the material from Earl Warren and his discussions having to do with his own staff. If it will enrich the historical record as to what happened and or what the motivations of these individuals were, then it seems to me then the balance in the equation should be for disclosure.
I have a two-part question for you. Part one is, I think in your answer to Judge Thunheim about what other materials might be there, you didn't speak to the question of the film that you mentioned both in your probe interview as well as, I believe, in Corruption and Blood, that deals with anti-Castro Cubans and the group that was there. So I wonder if you could speak to that particular matter. And then, if I give you the other half of this, we'll kind of wrap it up in one big blow. Do you have any materials from your days with the HSCA?
Let me take the last question first. I have no documents at all. And anybody can go into my office and they won't find any land deals there either or anything else. And that's even in my private law office. But certainly when I was in the government, the same was true. I have nothing and walked in as I walked. I walked out, I should say, as I walked in. But as far as where the film is, again, I can only tell you that all of the material I assumed was in the same place. That is where all the documents were kept in the document area, as well as, and I say documents, I include in that not only statement witnesses and memos that were drafted, but films and medical evidence and other pieces of evidentiary value. So I can't tell you exactly what room it was in, but we had it in our possession.
And that film had been obtained from the Georgetown University Library?
That's my best recollection, is that our investigators and researchers found it in the Georgetown Library archives, as I recall.
And just for the record, the significance of this film, if it were now recovered, would be?
Well, it showed, again, it could be Sherlock Holmesian. It could mean everything, it could be nothing. On the one hand, it shows a lot of anti-Castro Cuban players with CIA contract people in a military training setting. There was some speculation, somewhat unclear, as to the direct identities of some of these people, and as I stand here now, I'm not going to tell you exactly who they were, but there was some of the major players in this whole case. Now, does that mean, for example, in direct answer to your question, Mr. Hall, that if we continued our probe into the anti-Castro Cuban connection with the CIA, that would show that the CIA in some fashion was responsible for the assassination? I can't say that, and I will not say that. And it doesn't mean also that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't act alone. I can't say that, but there's certain medical evidence that suggests, and other evidence, that perhaps he did not act alone. That's a whole different area of inquiry. So with respect to the film, it was just another piece in this great mosaic of trying to understand and recapture what occurred at a time. And that's one of the reasons why it was a fascinating view.
The critical piece here is this is a piece of material that you had previously seen in the course of your role as an investigator that is at the moment not available, or
Well, I don't know where it is,
right,
whether it's available or not, but
yes,
yes, I did see that in my role on the committee.
Thank you.
In your role with the committee, did you have anything to do with the probe into possible organized crime connections?
Yes, we try to probe and go down every avenue. That one of the things that Dick Sprague and I were committed to doing before we started. We, again, as I say, Judge, we didn't have any preconceptions. And again, if the evidence showed that it was Oswald and he acted alone without foreign intervention, that was it. We held no brief one way or the other, notwithstanding the impact we had from various sources, both from within the government and from without, who had antithetical points of view, and they were convinced of their positions. We weren't, as fact finders, but we did, from our point of view, check that area pretty carefully. We found some, what we consider to be tough talk, but no connection. Had we continued on, perhaps, and gone into the CIA activities with organized crime, we can only speculate. But we certainly, at the time, did not conclude that the mafia did it. That was something that we did not, we were unavailable, we just simply couldn't do based upon the unavailability of evidence.
Just one final inquiry. In the work that you did for the committee, you had gotten involved and were working for more than a year and then left under circumstances that you describe as your own dissatisfaction with the commitment of the Congress to the support of this enterprise. Were there any inquiries or initiatives that you have wondered about over the years, specifically whether there may have been areas, avenues of approach that you wished you might have taken that you could recommend to us as potentially fruitful in terms of identifying additional records?
Let me, if I may, set the record straight on how it was that we left, if that's permitted. I'll be brief. I was asked by the committee sometime in early 1977, when we were no longer funded, to speak to the membership of the House. And I did. And I tried to, I actually almost prevailed in speaking at all 435 of my bosses. Another phenomenon in a criminal investigation, which is a very difficult thing to deal with. In any event, it became apparent that the Congress, the members of the House, were not going to vote for the committee if Richard Sprague stayed on. And that was the excuse, in my mind. I use the word excuse to the extent that, based upon the requests we were making to continue the probe, which were denied, that the excuse was Richard Sprague. God only knows why. He was a brilliant lawyer, and he was a terrific prosecutor. He worked with our inspector for many years, and you know his background, I'm sure. And I could testify that he's a man of extraordinary integrity. And I told that to him the night before our vote, which was sometime on or about March 30th, 31st, 1977. And we went to see our chairman, who's a dear friend of mine to this day, Lou Stokes, Congressman Lou Stokes. And Dick resigned. And I virtually told him that the honorable thing to do would be that we resign. I say we, he was the focus of it, because we didn't want individuals to stand in the way of this investigation. Even though we felt it wasn't going to be what we thought it should be, perhaps we would be wrong and good things would result. That is, the truth would come out. So that's the reason why he resigned. I was then offered his job and could not accept it because I had asked him to resign. And I didn't want to live with the notion that there was a capillary in my body that might have suggested that, and I took his job. So I didn't do that and stayed for the transition. And that's the reason why I waited until the new chief counsel was in place. And that was sometime I left, I believe, in July of '77. But the major area, and I can't overemphasize this, focused on the government and what the government knew about Lee Harvey Oswald. What Hosty, the whole Hosty episode, which I'm sure you're experts on, and what the CIA was doing with Lee Harvey Oswald, and what he was doing in New Orleans with anti-Castro Cubans, rabid anti-Castro Cubans, and to get everything you could get from the government with respect to it, and how the government to this day could possibly want to withhold that information and feed the kind of anti-government feeling that results from non-disclosure is really beyond my comprehension. Because from everything I've said and observed during that period of time, and I've said today, that notwithstanding total disclosure, it still didn't appear from what we had seen that there was a conclusion that would, in fact, come up with a result that is somewhat different from what we have, to the extent that we would have someone else and or another group. That's not to say that based upon the evidence we uncovered, that members of our staff believe that Oswald alone was responsible for the assassination. We had another opinion, most respectfully, based upon the evidence. That would be the medical, ballistic, eyewitness, lack thereof, and contradictions and other kinds of information evidentiary-wise, which I won't go into unless you want me to.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tanenbaum. Appreciate your testimony this morning.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next witness this morning is Eric Hamburg. Mr. Hamburg was the co-producer of the Oliver Stone movie Nixon, the former congressional staff assistant who was involved in the passage of the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992. Welcome, Mr. Hamburg.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. I am a film producer here in Los Angeles, working with Oliver Stone. As you mentioned, I co-produced the film Nixon and also edited the book of the film. And in a prior incarnation, before coming to Hollywood, I worked for about 8 years on Capitol Hill in Washington as an aide to Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts and also to Representative Lee Hamilton of Indiana. And while on Congressman Hamilton's staff, I worked extensively during 1991-92 on the legislation which became the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992. And it was this legislation, as you know, which created the Assassination Records Review Board. So it's very gratifying to be here and appear before you today. I can assure you from personal experience that this bill could never have been passed by Congress if not for Oliver Stone's film, JFK. I can tell you more about the whole sequence of events if you're interested, but basically following the release of that film in late 1991, the Congress was inundated with letters from the American public demanding the release of the secret government files on the assassination. And many prominent members of Congress who had previously been indifferent to this issue or even had actively opposed release of the files changed their positions shortly after the release of JFK. The American public have Oliver Stone and his film to thank for the legislation which created this review board and allowed the opening of the JFK files. And I hope no one has any doubt about that. It was obvious then, and is still clear today, that the American people want to know the truth about who killed President Kennedy and why. That is why this law was passed and this board created. I hope that you will never lose sight of this fundamental fact as you pursue your work. The American people overwhelmingly believe that there was a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. Polls over the years, starting long before Oliver Stone made JFK, have shown that 80% to 90% of the American public believe that there was a conspiracy and that they have not been told the full truth. These figures remain the same today. While we do not yet know the full story, it is gratifying to know that an estimated 2 million to 3 million pages of government documents related to the assassination have been released since the passage of the JFK bill. You can correct me if I'm wrong on those figures, but that's what I'm told. The review board should be commended for the role that you have played in facilitating the release of these documents. And I would particularly commend you for fighting for the release of documents pertaining to the Garrison investigation, which have been withheld by New Orleans District Attorney Harry Connick, and also for seeking the release of some certain documents which the FBI has sought to withhold. It is very important that all of these documents be released and made public. It should be remembered that it was the intent of Congress to make all documents and files available in uncensored form to the maximum extent possible. Indeed, when this legislation was introduced, Senator David Boren, who was then chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, stated that it was the intention of the bill's sponsors that, quote, 99.99999% of all assassination-related material should be made public, and only in the rarest circumstances would a name or a word be blacked out from a document. Unfortunately, this standard has not been met. The FBI, and also in some instances the CIA, seem to have a mindset dating back to the days of the Cold War. And Army intelligence, to my knowledge, has yet to release any documents, or almost any documents at all, and also very little, I think, from naval intelligence. Frankly, it is ridiculous, in my opinion, to think that 33 years after the events in question, there are still sources and methods to be protected. And in any case, the public's right to know the facts about the assassination outweighs any such considerations after this length of time. In my view, all of the documents from these agencies should be released unredacted as soon as possible. Any material that is withheld will simply serve to undermine public confidence in this entire process. I would just second what Mr. Tanenbaum has said in that regard. With this in mind, I would like to make a few suggestions as to areas which I think can and should be pursued in relation to additional documents. One area that has been of particular interest to me personally has been the question of Cuba and the possible participation of Cuban exiles, that is to say anti-Castro Cuban forces, in the assassination plot. Most serious researchers who have studied the assassination have concluded that there were most likely elements of three groups involved in the plot: rogue elements of U.S. intelligence agencies, elements of organized crime or the mafia, and elements of the Cuban exile groups in the United States. The plot, if there was one, most likely evolved out of the assassination plots against Fidel Castro, which involved these three groups. I have long felt that for many reasons, including barriers of language and culture, we have had perhaps the least understanding of the Cuban, quote-unquote, element. For this reason, I was very interested when the Cuban government put forward a semi-official version of their view of the assassination events in late 1993. I myself made 2 trips to Cuba in 1994 and spent a total of about 2 weeks there, holding extensive meetings with General Fabian Escalante, the Cuban official in charge of their investigation of the JFK assassination. I also had additional conversations with General Escalante and his colleague Arturo Rodriguez at a conference last year in Rio de Janeiro. I was very impressed by the depth and extent of the Cubans' knowledge about these events, and also the potential for useful exchanges of information and documents with the Cubans. Needless to say, Cuba is a communist country and is not a democracy, and any information emanating from Cuba must be treated with appropriate caution. Nevertheless, Cuba has a great volume of files and documents which are relevant to this case. They have many files dating back to the early 1960s on Cuban exile groups and specific individuals, as well as mafia and CIA figures who were active in Cuba. Many of these would be very relevant to your work and would be of great interest. As you may know, the House Select Committee on Assassinations did visit Cuba and met with Fidel Castro and other Cuban officials in pursuit of information relevant to their inquiry, I believe in 1978. I would strongly recommend that this board do likewise. Notwithstanding the fact that the United States does not maintain diplomatic relations with Cuba, I believe that the Cuban government would be receptive to such an approach and would be willing to produce files and documents which have not yet been made public. This is a treasure trove of information which has not yet been tapped and could be one of the most productive areas of inquiry left to be explored. Specifically, I'd just like to mention a few specific points to try to be helpful and also put some new information on the record that has not been made public, to my knowledge. Specifically, General Escalante has stated in interviews conducted for the book ZR Rifle by Claudia Furiati, a Brazilian journalist, that he believes 2 Cuban exiles, Eladio del Valle and Herminio Diaz Garcia, took part in the assassination in Dallas. He told me that this was based on informant reports by Cuban sources which are in their files. He also named 3 Chicago Mafia figures, Dave Yaris, Lenny Patrick, and Richard Kane, whom he believes were in Dallas and also involved in the plot. Again, this is based, he says, on their informant reports. It would be very important to obtain any documents which Cuba could provide to substantiate these claims. And he did show me files of such documents, but I did not obtain copies of them. I'm not an official representative of the U.S. government, but they do exist. I would like to mention a couple of other specific points which are examples of the kind of information which could be gained from the Cuban documents and also from related U.S. documents. These are specific points which I had followed up with General Escalante and on which he provided new information to add to what we already know from American documents. One is in the area of Lee Harvey Oswald's mysterious trip to Clinton, Louisiana in August of 1963. It has never been clear why Oswald went to Clinton or what he was doing there. I was intrigued by the fact that, according to information obtained by Jim Garrison's investigators, Oswald had told people in the Clinton area that he was living or staying with a Cuban doctor at the local hospital named Frank Silva, or Francisco Silva. I asked General Escalante to check his files and see if he had any information on this individual. He reported back that according to his sources, Silva's full name was Francisco Silva Clarence, and that he was related to a Frank Barthez, whose full name was Francisco Barthez Clarence. Barthez lived in New Orleans and was a close associate of Carlos Bringuer, the head of the Cuban group DRE in New Orleans, who had a street brawl with Lee Harvey Oswald in August of '63. This incident took place shortly before Oswald's trip to Clinton. Barthez appeared at Oswald's court hearing after the incident on August 12, 1963, as a show of support for Bringuer. Barthez is discussed extensively in the book Oswald and the CIA by John Newman. I know you've heard from Mr. Newman before, where he is described as a CIA informant and operative. General Escalante even speculated that Frank Silva and Frank Barthez may actually have possibly been the same person, since both shared the first and last names of Francisco Clarence. This information would appear to provide a Cuban connection to Oswald's trip to Clinton, which is very interesting. Obviously, this should be followed up with a request for documents to corroborate this information. And it's my understanding that Dr. Silva is still living in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, I believe. General Escalante also provided additional information on another mysterious Cuban exile named Carlos Roca, who is discussed in the book Oswald Talked by Ray and Mary LaFontaine. Roca was also a member of the Cuban exile group DRE, which was funded and run by the CIA under the code name of AMSPEL. The DRE issued a press release in Mexico City on December 8, 1963, stating that Carlos Roca and 3 other DRE members had been killed in a battle in Cuba's Escambray Mountains in mid-September of '63. The others were identified as Andre Tartabull, Julio Garcia, and Sergio Perez. According to Escalante's information, only Tartabull was actually killed in this battle. Furthermore, he stated that Roca, according to him, was seen in Miami a day or two after the assassination of President Kennedy in the company of Juan Manuel Salvat, another member of the DRE. According to Escalante's information, they were on their way to Nicaragua at that time. Escalante said that Roca was also connected to Carlos Bringuer in New Orleans, who operated a business there called Casa Roca, or Roca House. Roca had gone to religious school in Cuba with Jose Bringuer, the brother of Carlos Bringuer, and after the Cuban Revolution, Roca had sought asylum in a Latin American embassy in Havana along with Jose Bringuer, according to this information. Escalante also stated that his files indicated that Roca was a qualified single-engine pilot. He pointed out that in Jim Garrison's investigation, David Ferry had told investigators that he traveled to Houston after the assassination and was supposed to pick up 2 of the assassins who were flying from Dallas in a single-engine plane. One of them was a Cuban named Carlos who would be flying the plane, and Escalante speculated that this may, in fact, have been Carlos Roca. According to Escalante's files, Mr. Salvat was in Dallas, he says, during the week of November 22nd, went to Miami, and then on to Nicaragua with Roca. He also stated that Mr. Salvat allegedly was in Mexico City when the allegedly false story about Roca's death was published in early December. Escalante said that according to his information, Salvat was an agent of David Phillips of the CIA, as was Angel Gonzalez, the DRE representative in Mexico City who issued the press release. He told me that his source was a human source for intelligence and that he had files and documents to substantiate this. Escalante speculated that Roca and the other DRE captains named in the press release, Julio Garcia and Sergio Perez, may have been involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. He thought that after the assassination, they were probably taken to a Cuban exile training camp at a place called Monkey Point in Nicaragua, near the border with Costa Rica. He thought that they had probably been killed there sometime between November 22nd and December 8th, and then a false press release was allegedly issued in Mexico City stating that they had been killed in a battle in Cuba in September. While I have no way to know if this is true and I'm not endorsing Escalante's views, this is obviously an area which should be followed up. If there are documents to corroborate any of this, they should be sought and made public. In Escalante's view, the Cuban exile groups DRE, Alpha 66, MRR, and Commandos L were all linked to each other and to the assassination. All available information and documents on these groups and others, such as CRC and other Cuban exile groups, UIR, there are a number of them, should be sought from both U.S. and Cuban sources, in my opinion. Escalante has also named another Cuban exile associate, Isidro Borjas, as being the person who was handing out leaflets with Oswald in front of the International Trade Mart in New Orleans on August 16, 1963. You've probably seen pictures of these two men, their skinny ties, handing out these leaflets. And the identity of this Latin-appearing man has always been a mystery, so he's identified him. Borjas was also a member of the DRE. Borjas is also discussed in John Newman's book, and I believe the picture appears there. He was interviewed by the House Select Committee, Borjas was, and told them that the DRE had relayed information to the CIA in August 1963 on Oswald's contacts with Bringuier in New Orleans. The DRE is discussed at length in both the Newman and LaFontaine books and is likely to have been a key group in the assassination conspiracy. In this connection, I would like to mention that it is my understanding that a large collection of files on the DRE have recently been donated to the University of Miami by Mr. Salvat, who I referred to earlier. These should be sought by the Review Board and added to the collection at the National Archives. Since it will be recalled that the University of Miami, where they are presently located, was formerly the home of the CIA's JM Wave station, it may not be the most suitable repository for these documents. Escalante also told me that Cuba has numerous files on David Morales, formerly the second in command of the JM Wave station. Escalante believes that Morales may have been in Dallas on November 22, 1963, and may have been in charge of the assassination operation on the ground in Dallas. He speculated that Morales may have been the person driving the Nash Rambler, which allegedly picked up Oswald outside the book depository. Morales is discussed extensively in the book The Last Investigation by Gate and Fonzie. Escalante also told me that according to his sources, Morales had met with Rolando Cubella, alias Amlash, who was a CIA asset, in Paris in September or October of 1963 as part of the CIA's ongoing effort to assassinate Fidel Castro. He believes that this was related to the plot against President Kennedy as well. There's much more, but this should be sufficient to illustrate why I feel it is important to seek any files and documents pertaining to the assassination from the government of Cuba. I hope that you will pursue this area. I also think that the Review Board should seek any files on this matter held by other foreign governments, especially the governments of Russia, Belarus, France, Japan, and Mexico. As you know, Oswald lived both in Russia and in what is now Belarus, whose capital is Minsk, for an extensive period of time. We know that the KGB had an extensive file on Oswald. Parts of this file have been made available to ABC News and to author Norman Mailer, among others. And the Review Board should also seek that file. The French government reportedly assisted in the publication of a book called Farewell America about the Kennedy assassination, and would have files pertaining to what has been called the French connection to the assassination. This is discussed in the book Conspiracy by Anthony Summers, among others. And of course, Oswald also allegedly made a mysterious trip to Mexico in 1963. Any files on this held by the Mexican government, for example, the DFS, which is their intelligence arm, should also be sought. Oswald also spent time at the Atsugi Air Force Base in Japan, and the Japanese government may have files on his time in Japan. Another area which should be pursued is the question of Kennedy and Vietnam, and whether the assassination may have had any relationship to Kennedy's efforts to end U.S. involvement in the war, which has been a subject of considerable controversy. Government records on this issue should be sought by the board. Specifically, a tape of a crucial National Security Council meeting of October 2nd, 1963 is held by the Kennedy Library in Boston. This should be made public. Also, all records of the Honolulu Conference of November 20th and 21st, 1963, which dealt with this issue, should also be made public. I would also suggest that the Review Board seek to obtain files and documents from the collections of private researchers and organizations. And as I'm sure you are aware, many of the prominent private JFK researchers have their own extensive collections of documents, as do some of the leading private research organizations. All of these collections should be sought and copies of these documents made available to the public at the National Archives to the maximum extent possible. I'm also submitting a copy of a letter which has been sent to the review board by Marina Oswald Porter, the widow of Lee Harvey Oswald. Mrs. Porter's letter details a number of areas of documents which should be pursued. It is my understanding that many of the documents mentioned in her letter still have not been released. And I would also like to mention that Mrs. Porter called me yesterday and asked me to submit an additional statement to you in connection with this hearing, and I've given some copies to Mr. Samalek of that statement, which is sort of a personal statement from her. So I would ask that that be included in the record. Probably 1 year is not sufficient time for the review board to complete all the work which needs to be done, although I commend you for taking the actions you have taken today to extend for an additional year. It would probably be a good idea for the board to seek an extension of its term by Congress, perhaps for another 2 years. But if the board is to extend its life, it should also extend the scope of its work. One of the powers which has been granted to the board by Congress is the power to subpoena witnesses and to take their depositions. I understand that this power has been used by the board already in a few instances. I think it would be a good idea for the board to make much broader use of this power, to take sworn statements from many key individuals who could provide information pertaining to the assassination and to possible sources of additional documents. And just to stimulate your thinking, I'll just name a few. There are many people still living who could potentially provide useful information. A few such names might include Gerald Ford, George Bush, Richard Helms, Ted Shackley, Howard Hunt, Nestor Sanchez, Sylvia Odio, Juan Manuel Salvat, Carlos Bringuer, Antonio Veciana, Francisco Silva, Lenny Patrick, Frank Ellsworth, James Hosty, John Elrod, and John Thomas Mason, among others. While I'm not suggesting, I certainly do not mean to imply in any way that any of these people were involved with the assassination of President Kennedy, they could provide useful information to the board and to the public. I think there's a myth that somehow that the trail is cold and that no one's still living who could provide any information. That's not true at all. There are many people still living who could provide very useful information to you. The review board has been entrusted with a great responsibility by Congress and by the American people. I hope that you will bear this in your minds as you pursue your work over the next year. I don't think that you will want to be remembered by history as the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee, and other official bodies have been remembered, leaving a legacy of doubt, distrust, and unanswered questions. The American people expect more from you. I commend you for the work you have done so far. You have set an important precedent for the opening up of closed chapters in our history, one which I believe should be also followed in other areas of our history as well. I hope that you will continue your work in the spirit of openness, accountability, and a search for the truth wherever it may lead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hamburg. We're running a little short of time, so we don't have time to ask any questions this morning. I hope that you will permit us to follow up with you on a number of these areas that appear to be very fruitful.
Sure, I would be happy to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we'd like to hear from Wesley Liebler. Mr. Liebler is a former assistant counsel to the Warren Commission and currently a professor of law at UCLA. Welcome, Mr. Liebler.
Thank you, Jeff. When Tom Samalek called me and asked me to come out here and testify, my first question was, what in heaven's name about? But in talking with him, I told him that I had in my own possession two documents that might be of interest. One is a report of a study that was done by a member of the faculty of the UCLA physics department back in 1965 or 1966, by the name of Brian Jones. And what happened was David Lifton actually raised some questions about the head jerk and shoulder buckle in the president's body just after he was struck by the final bullet in Zapruder film frame 312 or 313. And the questions were raised about the apparent backward movement of the president's body after Zapruder film 313. Even though Mr. Lifton apparently was aware of the fact that, they didn't tell me this, the the frames, the president's body apparently moved forward right at frame 312, between 312 and 313. But whatever, I just started teaching at UCLA, and I talked to some people at Life magazine and made arrangements for them to make a set of the Zapruder slides available in their office in Beverly Hills. And I called the chairman of the physics department at UCLA and told him who I was and asked him if there'd be anybody over there in the physics department who'd be interested in looking at these frames in the offices of Life magazine and writing a report on this particular question of what happened, what kind of motion was exhibited by the president's body right around frames 312, 13, and thereafter of the Zapruder film. And this young fellow, Brian Jones, walked into my office some days later. I never heard back from them until Jones walked into my office. And I must say he was very dubious about me, since I, as you already heard from two witnesses this morning, was associated with a notorious institution called the Warren Commission. But Jones went over and and went through these frames with a fine-tooth comb and eventually wrote a report. And I have 3 copies of it here, which I'd like to make available to the commission. His conclusions were that the movement of the president's body, it speaks for itself. I won't address it, but it was not inconsistent with a shot. Movement was not inconsistent with a shot from the rear. After Mr. Stone's movie did produce some things, there's no question about that. My wife told me that I had to go to it, and I said I absolutely refused. I said, I'm not going to pay 5 cents to go and see that piece of crap. But she said, well, you have to go. You owe it to yourself and presumably to posterity. So she said, I'll pay. It's the only time she's ever taken these movies, I think, in the entire time we've known each other. So she paid, and I went to the movie. And I was, quite frankly, interested in a lot of it because a lot of it was set in New Orleans, and many of the people that were portrayed fictitiously, for the most part, in Stone's movie, were people who whose names I was familiar with because I was the staff lawyer who was basically responsible for deciding which of these people in New Orleans who were associated with Oswald or might have been associated with Oswald, which of them to take to depose, to ask questions of ourselves. And that decision was basically made by going through FBI and Secret Service reports to see what those agencies had already developed. And so David Ferry and many of these people associated with him, I read the reports on them and decided that that it wasn't useful to take their deposition because the information developed by the agencies was quite adequate to the event. We did take Carlos Berengier's testimony. I think I took his testimony, and Sylvia Odio's testimony as well in Dallas. But what I did was, after I saw the movie, I went down to the stacks in the library in the law school at UCLA, and I dug out the work of the House Committee. I'm sort of, I guess you'd be ashamed to say that I never looked at it before. It had been laying down there covered with dust, and I dug it out and I started to look at it, and I was pleased to, and I'm sorry that my friend, later became my friend, Bob Blakey's not here to hear this compliment. I think that some of the work was extraordinarily good. Particularly their treatment of the single bullet theory, their analysis of the alignment and the trajectory problems that they studied and came up with a completely different approach than the Warren Commission did. The Commission worked from the window down. The House, as you know, started down in the car and worked back up. Of course, the results were essentially the same. The work of the House Committee confirmed the work of the Warren Commission. And the medical work. I was pleased to become a friend also of Mike Bodden, and he and I fell in love with each other almost instantly. And I offered him a deal. I said, Mike, I'll do your will, you do my autopsy. And I reported that to my wife, and she said, you better tell Dr. Bodden that I'm not going to have you autopsied. So I told Mike to make damn sure that I was autopsied under those circumstances. But I haven't done his will, and so far he hasn't done my autopsy. But in any event, I sat down and started going through the House materials, and I decided for about the third time that I was going to write a book about this. And I did do a lot of stuff, and then of course, as usual, lost interest in it, and had basically forgotten about it until I was talking to Tom Samlock earlier this summer. And I told him about this material that I had that was at this point just on computer disks here in my office at UCLA, and he said that he thought the committee ought to have it. So I came out a few days early and dug it out and ran it off and did a little bit of work on it. And I have, this is the typescript that I have, and I have 3 copies of that. which I put a copyright stamp on. I'm not giving it to you, but it's for your use as you see fit. Now, the first 6 chapters of that, I talk about the shots that hit the president, Governor Connolly's wound, the source of the shots, who fired the shot, the single bullet theory, and the question of trajectory, alignment, and the single bullet theory, on which issues the House Committee and the Warren Commission were almost 100% in agreement. There are some discrepancies as to the autopsy, and the next chapter is entitled Evaluation of the Autopsy, which wasn't, as we all know, the best in the world. And also, I think, make reference to the fact of what I regard as the failure or the remissness, if you will, of the Warren Commission in not using the autopsy photographs and x-rays to make sure that the drawings that these doctors made were right, and it turned out that they weren't. But that's, while it's unfortunate, it's water with the dam. I also have a chapter on the president's backward movement at the time of the headshot, and then 2 chapters on acoustical evidence and evaluation of the acoustical evidence, and that's what I want to focus on primarily in terms of what I think that, if you haven't done this, that I think that it would be a good thing for you to do. The House Committee, on the basis of acoustical evidence that appeared on a tape recording or a dictabelt or whatever was the recording of Channel 1 of the Dallas Police Department, these were studied by both Beranek and Newman in Cambridge, and then again by Weiss and Ashkenazi for the House Committee. Later by a committee set up by at the request of the Justice Department, which found that this was all nonsense, which I believe it was. But the last chapter of material here is an evaluation of the acoustical evidence. And it's really strange. If you just this fellow Bowles, who's now the sheriff in Dallas, I'm sure you talked to him if you had hearing in Dallas. I hope at least the Bowles testified before you, or that you got Bowles materials. If you haven't got Bowles materials, by all means get them. He wrote a piece on this and went through the tape and listened to it and put together a timeline, which is in the materials that I'm giving you. With respect to the movement of this motorcycle, it had the open microphone on which through which this recording was made. For about 5.5 minutes, this microphone was stuck open while this motorcycle was doing something. Part of the time it was moving, part of the time it was sitting. But of course, this is extremely important as to what exactly that motorcycle was doing during this period of time. For about 2 minutes, because right in the middle of this, for the first 2 minutes, 132 seconds, there's a sound of motorcycle engine noise running. It's a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. So I've listened to the tape. Perhaps you have too. You can't miss it. Okay, here's this old Harley chugging along at a rather constant speed for 132 seconds. During which time, the motorcycle is supposed to be accompanying the motorcade right down Main Street in Dallas, where the crowds are pressing in on the motorcycle, on the motorcade, to the point where the president's car has to stop. The motorcycle doesn't stop, it chugs right along. People are screaming and waving and yelling at the president in the motorcade. This microphone is wide open. There isn't a single iota of sound crowd noise on that tape. Not one. Just 2 minutes, 132 seconds, chug, 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 while the motorcade is coming down Main Street of Dallas with all these people shouting and screaming. The motorcade is stopping. The Secret Service people are jumping off the back car, running up to protect the president. Is barely moving, but the motorcycle is going right along happily for 132 seconds without slowing down. That creates a rather serious problem. Of course, it suggests the motorcycle wasn't in the motorcade at all, which is quite clear. Then the motorcycle slows down, and the theory was that it slowed down to make the turn onto Houston Street, and then both Beranek and the House Committee, which I think is a failure, extraordinary failure, they tell us that the motorcycle noise didn't increase, the engine noise didn't increase for 13 seconds. 13 seconds is relevant because it was, by that time that 13-second period had ended after the first 132 seconds, the so-called shots had been fired. The impulses or whatever waveforms on this tape were on the tape at that time. So all the House Committee tells us is that the motorcycle noise didn't increase for 13 seconds. Well, there's still another 2 minutes of tape where it's open. It's a very interesting question as to what in heaven's name was on the tape. And Bowles goes through this in great detail. There's a bell sound. The motorcycle engine is very slow idle. It revs up a little bit. It starts to move. Then it slows down again. Maybe another motorcycle comes up. It slows to idle. Somebody's whistling in the background. This is during the time that the motorcade is racing off to Parkland Hospital with the sirens screaming, including the siren of McLean's motorcycle, which is supposed to be the one from which this tape was recorded. Then, most interestingly, about 121 seconds after the motorcycle engine noise slowed down, all of a sudden we hear sirens. What we hear is the sound of sirens approaching, faint, and they grow loud, and then they become very loud, and then they fade away again. And this was supposedly recorded on a microphone that was on a motorcycle that was in the motorcade. Obviously, it was not in the motorcade. It was never in Dealey Plaza. I think that this acoustical evidence, and the conclusions of the House Committee as to the possible fourth shot from the grassy knoll and the possible conspiracy have been thoroughly discredited. But it doesn't seem to make much difference what the facts are, and I think in that sense you do have a hopeless task, because no matter what the facts are, people like the fellow who spoke here before will still, and Mr. Lifton will, and people like that will still not be satisfied as to what the actual facts appear to be. So I would think that I would get whatever Bowles had. I would materials. I would think I would try to get whatever materials that Bullitt, Baranek, and Newman has on this. And then, of course, I trying to let in my briefcase, but the Ballistics Acoustics Committee that studied this at the request of the Justice Department, I think, may also have some materials. I'm pretty sure they do. And I would think it would be useful to get all of this stuff together so that if someone wants to analyze this stuff later on, they can do it. I think that's basically the purpose of your group, is to get this stuff together so that it's there for history, because I'm sure we'll never be through with this, unfortunately. And there's nothing you can do that the Warren Commission and the House Assassinations Committee couldn't do. You are not any more superhuman than the rest of us. But get this material on the acoustic evidence. That's my primary recommendation. Thank you very much.
Members of the board, are there any questions for Mr. Liebler?
Well, I think you made an interesting point, and that is that it is our task to find out the documents and the facts in them, and a great many other people will have to deal with the truth, whatever that is. Thank you very much.
Next, we're going to hear from Mr. James Rankin. Mr. Rankin is the son of the former general counsel to the Warren Commission, the late J. Lee Rankin. He will testify about his father's personal papers related to his work for the Warren Commission. Welcome, Mr. Rankin.
Good morning, Chairman Tanenbaum and members of the Assassination Records Review Board. I'm pleased and proud to be here today. As you said, my father was a general counsel of the Warren Commission. Some of you may know he was also a Solicitor General in the Eisenhower administration, and he was the Attorney General in charge of the Office of Legal Counsel, which gave advice to President Eisenhower. Later, he was Corporation Counsel for the City of New York under Mayor John Lindsay, so he had quite a public legal career. I have some prepared remarks, but I would first like to inject a personal note. My father never discussed his work with his family. None of us knew that he had 17 cartons of records related to the Warren Commission until about 6 months ago. He had a total of 80 boxes of his professional correspondence and papers, 17 of which are Warren Commission things. As the family has looked at these, my brother is the only one that's looked at them carefully besides Mr. Gunn, we realized he had a rather central role in the Commission's investigation and report. So far, as I said, my brother and Mr. Gunn are the only ones who have reviewed this, and my comments are based upon what I've learned from them. My brother has prepared a summary of the contents of these cartons, which I'm going to leave with the board. During his tenure on the Warren Commission, my father acted as a principal intermediary between the members of the Commission and the very talented Commission staff, some of which are here today. In this capacity, he was in the unique position of witnessing both of the deliberations of the Commission and the research work, analysis, and drafting performed by the staff. I will describe briefly some of the Warren Commission materials that Father retained. First, and I've brought them with me today, I'm going to turn them over to Mr. Marwell at the end of my remarks, are loose-leaf notebooks kept by my father's secretary, Julia Eide, which are daily logs of every telephone call and every conference that my father had during the time he worked on the Warren Commission. They also report frequently the time each staff member reported for work and left, often leaving after 9 o'clock at night. Secondly, there are many original memoranda prepared by my father, for my father, by staff members of the Warren Commission. Although it is my understanding that most, if not all, of these memos are available as copies at the National Archives, my father's collection includes many signed originals. Some of the originals are by people who have become eminent in the world of politics and law. For example, there are signed originals by Senator Arlen Specter, Professor Norman Redlick, Professor John Hart Ely, Mr. David Belin, who is here today, Professor Wesley Liebler, and others. Third, the papers contain numerous drafts of the various chapters of the Warren Report. Many of these drafts contain original handwritten comments by Gerald Ford, Alan Dulles, John McCloy, Senator Richard Russell, and of course my father. These drafts provide an extremely valuable look at the development of the analysis and understanding of the Commission members over time. It is my understanding that although some of the drafts previously have been available in the archives, my father's papers contain many more drafts and also include the original handwritten annotations. Finally, there are many miscellaneous papers that range from press clippings to financial information about the Commission and its budget, information on the publication of the final report, who was to get original copies, so forth. One item from my father's Warren Commission materials which I am retaining is a leather-bound copy of the report which has been inscribed by several of the Commission members. The inscriptions are quite revealing in terms of the role my father played in the Commission's work. Since they are short, I would like to read them, and I am including a copy of these inscriptions in the donated materials. These are the inscriptions. For J. Lee Rankin, in grateful appreciation of his dedicated service and leadership in the preparation of this report, signed Earl Warren. For J. Lee Rankin, a great American who made this report possible, from his friend, Hale Boggs. To Lee Rankin, in deep appreciation of the painstaking, objective, and wise handling of this historic investigation, it was in the best tradition of a lawyer-like analysis and presentation of the facts. John J. McCloy. To the Honorable Lee Rankin, your searching inquiry, thorough preparation, exhaustive examination, but all accompanied by objectivity and fairness, made our work thorough, fair, and I believe a correct finding. With admiration, sincerely, John Sherman Cooper. For Lee Rankin, an appreciation for the superb work and tremendous leadership which was invaluable to all of us. Without your dedicated, unselfish service, this job could not have been done. I am most grateful for the opportunity to know you well, Gerald Ford. And finally, to J. Lee Rankin, as our General Counsel, you had the tough job of pulling together a great mass of evidence and persuading 7 stubborn men. This you did with calm and just plain hard work. I enjoyed every minute of my work with you and am proud of the report of which you are the main artisan. All best wishes, Alan Dulles. My family and I would like to contribute all of my father's papers that relate to his Warren Commission service to the American people to be included in the National Archives. I would also like to mention that the remainder of his papers are being donated to the University of Nebraska Law School, where my father graduated with his law degree. Thank you. I'd like to turn these things over to Mr. Marlowe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rankin. These materials will certainly enrich the record that the Review Board has been compiling, and we thank you very, very much on behalf of the Review Board. I wonder if members have any brief questions for Mr. Rankin while he's up here.
I have no questions, but I think this is a marvelous thing to enrich history and its view. Those of us who deal with documents love annotated documents. They're very, very rich. We are very grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rankin. Next, we're going to ask David Belin to come forward, please, for testimony. Mr. Belin is the former assistant counsel to the Warren Commission. He's also the author of 2 books on the assassination. One is entitled November 22, 1963, You Are the Jury. The other one is entitled Final Disclosure, The Full Truth About the Assassination of President Kennedy. Mr. Belin also served as executive director of the Rockefeller Commission in 1975, which investigated CIA involvement in assassinations of foreign leaders. Mr. Belin, welcome.
Thank you, Judge. I have a formal 9-page typewritten statement with a couple of exhibits attached, which I'm going to leave with you when I am finished. It has some interlineations because I was out of the office yesterday, did not have time to get the final changes made. I want to summarize, highlight a portion of what my formal statement includes. A vocal group of assassination revisionists are poised like scavengers to attack the Assassination Records Review Board. They will play to the grandstand when the board has completed its work, crying out, "If you would have released everything, we would have finally found the truth about the assassination." Leading this group will be individuals associated with JFK, the greatest electronic cover-up fraud ever perpetrated on America's movie screens. Jack Valente, president of the Motion Picture Association of America, has denounced JFK, and these are his words, a hoax, a smear, and pure fiction that rivals the Nazi propaganda films of Leni Riefenstahl. In Valente's words, and I'm quoting, "In scene after scene, Mr. Stone plasters together the half-true and the totally false, and from that he manufactures the plausible. In much the same way young German boys and girls in 1941 were mesmerized by Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, in which Adolf Hitler was depicted as a newborn god. Both JFK and Triumph of the Will are equally a propaganda masterpiece and equally a hoax. Unfortunately, the standards of JFK are also incorporated in another widely seen electronic misrepresentation of the truth, the 5-hour arts and entertainment cable network series, The Men Who Killed Kennedy, which also covers up the truth about the assassination. The challenge this Assassination Records Review Board faces is how to best discharge its duties in the face of a torrential downpour of disinformation that has dominated the media world and will continue after the work of this board is completed. It is in this context that I have come to Los Angeles to share my perspectives with the board, and so that there is no misunderstanding of the dangers that you face. You've just heard Mr. Hamburg, co-producer of the film Nixon with Mr. Stone, say that if you don't release everything, remember, there's going to be a legacy of doubt, distrust, unanswered questions, in which he maligned the Warren Commission as well as the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And that's the challenge that you face. Now, in addressing the challenge you face, I'm going to have 2 alternative recommendations, but in order to get these in perspective, I want to first start with a frame of reference to understand how I approach this issue. First, as you know, I served as counsel to the Warren Commission in 1964. I was one of the 2 lawyers concentrating on what we called Area 2, the determination of who killed President Kennedy, which was expanded to include who killed Officer Tippit. We interviewed the witnesses at the time, shortly after the event, when their recollections were the freshest and therefore the best. In undertaking our investigation, we followed but one standard, a standard that was established by Chief Justice Earl Warren in our very first meeting. Truth is our only goal. It was a standard that Lee Rankin followed. It was a standard that Professor Liebler followed. It was a standard that all of us followed. In 1975, President Ford appointed me as executive director of the Commission on CIA Activities within the United States. It became known as the Warren Commission, as the Rockefeller Commission, because Vice President Rockefeller served as its chairman. By the way, another member of the commission was Ronald Reagan. In my investigation, I was the first outside person to uncover the fact that the CIA had been engaged in assassination plots directed against foreign leaders. Information that had been wrongfully withheld from the Warren Commission. So what did I do? Well, in the fall of 1975, after I returned to my law practice in Des Moines, I filed Freedom of Information Act requests from the unique perspective of having had access to all of the CIA files concerning the assassination of President Kennedy, having had access to all of the Warren Commission files, and so I filed these requests asking that all of the documents be released. From the CIA files concerning the assassination, the remaining 2 or 3% of the Warren Commission files that hadn't been released. Now, having interviewed the key witnesses, I already knew what the facts were. I can say with absolute certainty, Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman who killed President Kennedy, wounded Governor Connally, and killed Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit on November 22, 1963. Neither the CIA nor any other governmental agency was in any way directly or indirectly involved, nor were any so-called rogue elements directly or indirectly involved. The evidence beyond a reasonable doubt is that Oswald was a lone gunman. Jack Ruby was in no way conspiratorially involved. As a matter of fact, unbeknownst to most people, he offered to take a lie detector test, which confirmed that everything he told the Warren Commission was true. In an effort to help the public understand the truth about the assassination, I have written 2 books. Royalties of both books have been donated to charity, as well as all of my speaking engagements, all writing fees of anything connected with the assassination. Now, with this background as to what my perspective is, I want to contrast this with what I call the assassination revisionists and their cover-up of the truth, because it's important that although you are not here to determine whether the Warren Commission was right or wrong, I think it's important for you to understand the nature of what takes place, because it's going to better help you discharge your responsibilities as you seek to complete the record of your work. Let me use 2 examples from JFK, one of which involves the Tippit murder, which I call the Rosetta Stone to understanding the truth about the assassination. Officer Tippit, J.D. Tippit, was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald 45 minutes after the assassination. The Tippit murder is such an open and shut case that one wonders how the American public could be so readily deceived by assassination revisionists. William Scoggins, the cab driver who was parked in his cab, whose testimony I took in the spring of 1964 in Dallas, told how he heard shots, he looked up, saw the policeman fall, saw the gunman come as close to him as 10 or 12 feet, muttering either "poor damn cop" or "poor dumb cop." Scoggins identified Oswald as the gunman. So did 5 other witnesses: Barbara Davis, Virginia Davis, Sam Gunyard, Ted Calloway, Helen Markham. Not only do you have 6 eyewitnesses who identified Oswald as the gunman, but you found cartridge cases at the scene of the Tippit murder, which Barbara Davis, Virginia Davis, and a witness by the name of Domingo Benavides turned over to the police. Those cartridge cases came from Oswald's revolver that he pulled out in the Texas theater as police approached. The bullets in Tippit's body, according to the FBI ballistic experts, were too mutilated to be ballistically identifiable. An independent expert, Mr. Nicole, said one of them could be identified as coming from Oswald's revolver. Now, in the face of these facts showing Oswald's guilt, JFK and a host of revisionist books portrays the Tippit murder as having been committed by 2 people, neither one of whom was Oswald. Common sense would say to anyone that the Dallas Police Department would have moved heaven and earth to try and find whoever killed one of their police officers, if it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. By the way, common sense would also say that if Oswald was not the lone gunman who killed President Kennedy, nearly killed Texas Governor John Connally, Jacqueline Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Governor Connally would have left no stone unturned to find out who the gunman was. Now that's one example of the Tippit film. The other thing I'm going to talk about, it's perhaps the most flagrant lie of JFK because it occurs at the very end of the film after the movie action is over. In essence, the lie is in two parts, and it is a permanent indictment of Hollywood in general and Warner Brothers and Oliver Stone in particular. Here is what viewers see on movie screens and on videotapes on a film that has been distributed to classrooms across the country with a JFK study guide, financed in part by Warner Brothers. Here's what it says in print after the movie's over. A congressional investigation from 1976 to 1979 found a probable conspiracy in the assassination of John F. Kennedy and recommended the Justice Department investigate further. Now here's what they say. As of 1991, the Justice Department has done nothing. What the movie did in a single paragraph was to state two lies, one by omission and one by commission, and then put this in a cosmetic framework because the movie at the end is dedicated to the young in whose spirit the search for the truth marches on. First, the lie of omission. The movie viewers have just seen Oswald depicted as an innocent patsy, and Earl Warren depicted as a cover-up participant. Now, the findings of that 1976 to 79 investigation, as everyone knows who is familiar with the findings, were that Oswald fired all of the shots that struck President Kennedy and Governor Connally, that the single bullet theory of the Warren Commission was correct, that Oswald was the lone gunman who killed Officer Tippit. All of this is directly contrary to JFK's and Jim Garrison's theory, which is enunciated here by Mr. Hamburg, of triangulation. The fact that Oliver Stone and Warner Brothers mentions a congressional investigation without mentioning the conclusion that Oswald was the one who killed President Kennedy and Officer Tippit is one major lie by omission. Related to this major lie of omission is another key omitted fact, the last-minute switch of a majority of the Congressional Committee believing in probable conspiracy that was based on purported acoustical evidence, which in 1982 was scientifically disproved by the Committee on Ballistic Acoustics. Professor Liebler has just talked about that. It was not the whole committee that fell victim to this. It was a committee majority. There were dissenting reports filed, as you know. But as bad as these lies of omission were, the big lie of commission is even worse, and that's what you people face as you consider what you're going to do toward the end of your review. The allegation that as of 1991, the Justice Department has done nothing is not some actor making a statement as part of a movie plot. It is Warner Brothers and Mr. Stone telling the American public, indeed the entire world, that there was a recommendation for the Justice Department to investigate further, and that as of 1991, the Justice Department has done nothing. How could Hollywood, how could Warner Brothers, how could Oliver Stone dare to make such a false statement when the truth was so readily ascertainable? Here are the facts. A majority of the House Select Committee assassinations on the basis of acoustical evidence concluded there was a fourth shot fired from the grassy knoll that missed everything. 125 feet fired downhill. They not only missed the limousine, the occupants of the limousine, they missed the limousine. But because the minority disagreed, there was a recommendation that the Justice Department investigate further. What happened next was that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is part of the Department of Justice, undertook further investigation and prepared a report on November 19, 1980, concluding the acoustical evidence findings were not valid. However, there was substantial question whether or not that FBI investigation was scientifically sound. Therefore, the Justice Department requested in the fall of 1980 that the National Research Council establish the Committee on Ballistic Acoustics. It was comprised of outstanding scientists from across the country, was chaired by Dr. Norman Ramsey, a Nobel laureate professor of physics from Harvard. As of May 17, 1982, the Committee on Ballistic Acoustics published a 96-page report. The introduction on page 3 completely disproved the lies of the JFK script that said as of 1991, the Justice Department had done nothing, because here's what it said. The Committee on Ballistic Acoustics was established by the National Research Council in the fall of 1980 in response to a request from the Department of Justice for a review of the methodology employed in the evaluations of the recorded acoustic data and of the conclusions about the existence of a shot from the grassy knoll. Now, in my written statement, I include highlights from the conclusions of that committee. They found out, number one, there was no scientific basis for the purported acoustical evidence conclusions. Number two, they found there was independent evidence that showed that the so-called electronic impulses took place a minute after the assassination. And number three, they pointed out, as Professor Liebler has said, that the dictabelt was evidently not on the motorcycle, or not recorded from a stuck microphone in a motorcycle, the motorcade, because it didn't pick up the sounds of sirens as the motorcade sped from the assassination scene of Parkland. There was no sound of revving up a motorcycle engines. There were sounds of chimes, but none of those were there were no chimes in Dealey Plaza. Officer McLean, by the way, who was the driver of the motorcycle that the House Committee experts said had the stuck microphone, said my microphone wasn't stuck. Now, we've heard a lot about the dangers of Hollywood and violence, but as bad as all of Hollywood's violence is, the deliberate dissemination of lies attacking our government and governmental institutions is even worse. Trust is the mortar that holds the structure of our government together, and when a Hollywood film dedicated to the young and whose spirit the search for truth marches on lies to the young as well as to everyone else that the assassination of President was a coup d'etat undertaken by agencies of the United States government and covered up by the Chief Justice of the United States. It's a terrible attack on citizen trust. When the truth is submerged, the survival of a free society and civilization is threatened. And from a long-range standpoint, nothing could be worse than this electronic downpour of lies. Now, with the foregoing as a frame of reference, I make these two alternative recommendations to this board. First alternative. This is the one that I prefer. I would urge that the Assassination Records Review Board release every single document in CIA files concerning the assassination of President Kennedy, and also all the remaining Warren Commission files, about 2% of those files, that have not previously been released. Having had access to all of this information, I know that will not in any way diminish the validity of the determination by the Warren Commission and the determination of the House Select Committee on Assassinations that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman who killed President Kennedy, wounded Governor Connally, and killed Officer Tippit on November 22, 1963. And it would not in any way diminish the findings of the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations that all of the shots that struck President Kennedy and Governor Connally were fired by Lee Harvey Oswald from the southeast corner 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository Building. Although I am well aware of the arguments that the CIA and the National Archives may make concerning personal privacy and protection of sources and methods, I believe that the CIA is precluded from raising these kinds of issues because it does not have what in law is called clean hands. The reason is that the CIA improperly withheld from the Warren Commission evidence of CIA assassination plots against Fidel Castro, evidence that was very important for the Warren Commission to have in light of its investigation into the possibilities of foreign conspiracy and counter-conspiracy. The public in the long run will be far better served to have this information released, not just because it will reconfirm the findings of the Warren Commission, but because it will also destroy whatever remaining arguments there are by assassination revisionists like the JFK crowd, who falsely assert that the withholding of these files is part of a continuing cover-up, when in fact it is they who are the ones who cover up the truth about the assassination. That alternative number one basically conforms to what I did personally in 1975 when I called on the National Archives and the CIA to release everything. Now, if you choose not to do this, and I know thus far you are not releasing everything, but you always have the opportunity to change your minds before your charter is over. If you choose not to do this, then, as the second best alternative, I would suggest the following. I believe this Assassination Records Review Board should affirmatively state in its final report the following. A, there is no document that has not been released that in any way whatsoever diminishes the determination of both the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations that all of the shots that struck President Kennedy and John Connally on November 22, 1963 were fired by Lee Harvey Oswald from the southeast corner 6th floor window of the Scuba Depository Building. B, there is no document that has not been released that in any way whatsoever diminishes the determination of both the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations that Lee Harvey Oswald killed Officer J.D. Tippit. C, there is no document that has not been released that in any way whatsoever diminishes the determination of the findings of the Committee on Ballistic Acoustics, which concluded that there was no scientific validity to the erroneous acoustical evidence which persuaded a majority of the House Select Committee on Assassinations to conclude there was a fourth shot fired from the grassy knoll by an unseen gunman who missed not only hitting the occupants in the presidential limousine, but the limousine itself. D, there is no document that has not been released that in any way whatsoever shows that Jack Ruby, who volunteered to take a lie detector test, a test which confirmed that everything he told the Warren Commission was true, was in any way conspiratorially involved in the assassination. E, if the board is unwilling to make the foregoing statements, which, having had access to all of these documents, I know to be true, then the board at the very least should release to the public any document which the board feels precludes it from making the foregoing affirmative statements. Otherwise, assassination revisionists will falsely accuse the board of a cover-up, just as they have falsely accused Earl Warren, and I wrote these words before I heard what Mr. Hamburg said, because that was a threat that he's made to you. Anyone who has had access to the Warren Commission files and the CIA assassination files, as I've had, knows that these are the facts. Moreover, I not only have the knowledge of the files, but I also have the knowledge of having interviewed the key witnesses to the assassination of President Kennedy and the murder of Officer Tippit in 1964, shortly after the events occurred, when the memories of these witnesses were the freshest and best. I am attaching to my formal statement and incorporating by reference copies of March 17, 1992 and June 25, 1993 op-ed pieces that I wrote for the New York Times. The fees for these pieces, like the royalties for my books about the Kennedy assassination, as I have previously said, have been turned over to charity. I have no financial interest in the outcome of what this Assassination Records Review Board does. However, what I do have is a deep concern about the electronic dissemination of lies about the assassination in movies like JFK and cable television programs like the 5-hour A&E entertainment series, The Men Who Killed Kennedy. And it is for this reason that I have flown to California to make this presentation before this Assassination Review Board, and because I care for the truth and I care for my country. In closing, I want you to know that for me, as I speak today, the ultimate issue is not who killed President Kennedy, wounded Governor Connally, and killed Officer Tippit. I already know the answer to that. It was Lee Harvey Oswald. For me, the ultimate issue is whether there will be any change in the present course and direction of the electronic media as profit-seeking corporations and individuals give priority to misrepresentations and deceit over truth, going so far as to infiltrate our school system with the virus of lies. The present course of the electronic media poses a clear and present danger for the future of democracy in America. If I leave any legacy on this earth, beyond my 5 wonderful children, it will not be that historians will ever remember the name of David Belin. But what I have done for more than 25 years in standing up for the truth and defending Earl Warren might in some small way be a tiny beacon of light that will point the way to people of vision and idealism who recognize that truth is the foundation of civilization. they will understand how important it is for Americans to understand the truth about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. They will understand how important it is to expose the misrepresentations of assassination revisionists and the electronic downpour of deceit in movies like JFK and television programs like The Men Who Killed Kennedy. They will help resurrect the reputation of Earl Warren, who has been the victim of libel and slander, of which perhaps the worst was the false testimony by Oliver Stone before a congressional committee in April 1962 that Earl Warren was partially senile. And above all, they will help restore trust and confidence in government, the mortar which binds a free society. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any question you want. There isn't any question that anyone can ask about who was the government who killed President Kennedy and Officer Tippit that I can't answer. If you give me a chance, of course, 30-second television bites doesn't do that, but I'm at your will.
Questions, members?
I would.
Go ahead, Bill.
Mr. Belin, your work both with the Warren Commission and the Rockefeller Commission exposed you to a great many records. I'm wondering if either in your own case or in that of those of your colleagues, if you're aware of any records still in private hands as an outcome of that work that we might be interested in pursuing.
There are these documents that I think are the most important documents in private hands, and I'll tell you a story about it. It's the original copy of the Zapruder film. It's the best copy. It's the easiest one to see, as Professor Liebler said, that from frame 312 to 313, there was movement of the president's head forward. By the way, it was not just his head that moved backward after frame 313, it's his head and his body. And experts from both the Rockefeller Commission and the House Select Committee assassination showed that it was a massive neurological damage which caused this extremity body movement backwards. In 1975, Time magazine was deciding what to do with this original film. I wrote the chief executive officer, or one of the officers of Time, and I said, you know, this is a national treasure. If you're going to sell it, I have a private foundation that would like to get a copy of it, pay for it, and turn it over to the National Archives, because that's where it belongs. Instead, what they did is they either sold it for a nominal sum or gave it back to the Zapruder family. I really think the Zapruder family has a moral obligation to turn that Zapruder film and whatever original copies of slides were made from that, we have from the Warren Commission a set of the slides over to the National Archives. And I would really urge this Assassination Records Review Board to ask the Zapruder family to do that. Mr. Zapruder got a lot of money for that film. A newspaper reports purported to say that he turned over $25,000 to Officer Tippit's widow, implying that was all he got from life. I think the family got about $150,000. But, and you know, today that's, you know, worth like close to $1 million. But I really think that's the one thing that could be turned over. The only other thing that I think, you know, I think you've seen everything in the, are getting access to see everything in the CIA files. And I just don't let, I would urge that you not let them stonewall you with this protection of sources and methods. The CIA really has unclean hands, and they will learn something by not being able to protect us. They'll learn something that the next time there's any kind of a presidential commission which says that agencies should cooperate and do everything possible, they will do it. They'll say, remember what happened to us when we didn't do it with the Warren Commission. We eventually, because of the Assassination Records Review Board, had to disclose everything. So that would be my advice to you people. But you're the final judges.
Well, as you know, Mr. Belin, we've made great effort to do what you're asking us. We are opening a great many documents that have not been opened. And we're not very protective as far as the agency is concerned. One of the things I wanted to ask you, though, I was reminded as you were talking, it has been suggested that it wasn't so much that the Warren Commission was subject of disbelief, but that after the Warren Commission, the documents were withheld, and that it was the withholding of documents for almost 30 years that actually stimulated the suspicion surrounding the Warren Commission. Do you think that was possible? Do you think we will not hopefully have to face that, but has that ever entered into your thinking about this?
Well, Dr. Nelson, I have been very candid in saying that the Warren Commission made a major mistake in one particular area of documents, and by the way, this is probably just a response to Dr. Joyce. The Warren Commission, at the request of the Kennedy family through Robert Kennedy, determined not to release the Kennedy autopsy photographs and x-rays. And Professor Liebler is absolutely right. We should have had access to the original autopsy photographs and x-rays. The rationale was that whatever exhibits we had would be turned over to the public. Earl Warren basically was persuaded by Robert Kennedy not to have these released. I think the Kennedy family felt as a matter of privacy, perhaps they didn't want magazines to publish as the last pictures of President Kennedy, these horrible photographs and x-rays. I never saw them myself until the Rockefeller investigation, when we had a panel of experts because charges were made that the CIA was involved in the assassination and the shots came from the front, so we had an independent panel of experts that reviewed this. Now, I believe that you are absolutely correct that one of the reasons that there was misbelief in the Warren Commission findings was that these autopsy photographs and x-rays were not released. And as soon as you had anything not released, people say, well, what else haven't you released? The fact is that 19 out of 20 doctors on 4 different medical panels, including the House Select Committees, Rockefeller Commissions, the Ramsey-Clark panel, and the original autopsy panel, say that all of the shots came from the rear. But more important than that, ballistically you have the bullets, the nearly whole bullet found off Governor Connolly's stretcher, and the ballistically identifiable portions of the bullet that struck President Kennedy's head. Those were shown to have come from Oswald's rifle found in the School Book Depository building. The cartridge cases found in the window where Howard Brennan saw the gunman fire came from that rifle. Now, what can you do about the people that say, well, what about the rest of the exhibits? The problem you face is that you have some issues involving sources and methods and privacy. And the other part of the problem is what I tried to illustrate in giving the two key examples, and there are hundreds of others, of lies when people basically, every document involved in the Tippit murder has been released. And this is something you ought to consider in your final report. Every document involving the Tippit murder has been released. You have 6 eyewitnesses identifying Oswald the gunman. You got the ballistic evidence, and yet these people say that Oswald didn't kill Tippit. What can you do about that? What can you do at the end of a film, JFK, after all the plot is over, they say something in words in black and white that says the Justice Department has done nothing, when the Justice Department basically specifically asked the National Research Council to do something which they did when they formed the Committee on Ballistic Acoustics. And therefore I'm going to say that it's up to you to consider including in your report examples of this, and that's why I say as the alternative, if you don't want to release everything, I think you 5 good people who have no connection with the Warren Commission, no connection with the House Select Committee on Assassinations, no connection with the Rockefeller Commission, can honestly say, well, if we've chosen not to release anything or redact anything, it's not because it in any way suggests that Oswald is not the lone gunman who killed Kennedy and Winnet County. It does not suggest that Oswald was not the gunman who killed Tippit. It does not suggest that the Committee on Ballistic Acoustics was inaccurate. It does not suggest that Jack Ruby didn't tell the truth when he testified for a life warrant commission. It's because we really think that this is a particular source of method, or this is a particular matter of privacy that we should not disclose. And that's why I'm here today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Belin, for your testimony
Thank you.
today.
I have copies of my written statement, which I will give to each one of you.
Very
and
well.
I'll give typewritten copies, which will take care of the final drafts, which will take care of the interlineations.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Next witness today is Mr. James DiEugenio. He is the author of a book entitled Destiny Betrayed, JFK, Cuba, and the Garrison Case, which is an analysis of New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison's inquiry and of the assassination itself. Mr. DiEugenio, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I'm momentarily stunned after Mr. Belin's presentation. I'll try not to divert from my remarks, so it'll be kind of difficult. Well, I'd like to welcome the review board here, and thank you for coming to beautiful downtown LA. I appreciate the opportunity to offer anything I have to say about here, and I'll get right to some of the main points, I think, concerning the board and what they should be seeking to declassify. According to some of the sources I have in Washington, some of the executive session transcripts of the Warren Commission have yet to be declassified. Okay, and that was a couple months ago. I don't know what the situation is now. But those are very important because I think a lot of them, the ones that were declassified since 1993, show that the Warren Commission had a problem. I don't know what Mr. Liebler or Liebler or Mr. Belin have to say about this, but the Warren Commission definitely had a problem with the single bullet theory. And I think if you look at the transcript, Mr. Rankin actually says it in those exact words. So if there are still executive session hearings that are not declassified yet, I think that they would have those kinds of interesting tidbits in them, which I think go right to the heart of the problem. Okay, and also the executive sessions of the House Select Committee should also be next on the agenda, and because these are some very interesting people, like Richard Helms and James Angleton and Robert Mayhew, okay, that the public needs to look at. Also, all the communications between Robert Blakey and his chief aide, Gary Cornwall, okay, need to be declassified. These would be like, I imagine, the working papers going towards a final draft of the HSCA report. And if they aren't there, then Mr. Cornwall and Mr. Blakey should be subpoenaed because they would most likely have them. I find it very hard to believe that they would just be destroyed. Okay, and any other documents that, especially Mr. Cornwall, took with them, I don't think Mr. Blakey took anything with him because the last days of the committee he was actually calling the CIA and asking them to come over and get any documents. So Mr. Cornwall probably did take some stuff. I don't think Mr. Blakey did. Okay, as time goes on, the figure of Clay Shaw becomes more and more fascinating. And even the official record on Clay Shaw is incomplete. In 1967, the CIA answered a query by Ramsey Clark. In this communication, they stated that that Mr. Shaw had filed 30 reports with the CIA as a DCS agent, domestic contacts. According to my sources, at the archives, there's 9 of those reports. What happened to the others? Okay, and if there is no written record, is there any notation of any kind of oral communications? And also, since JFK came out, the story about Clay Shaw being solely a domestic contact agent has completely collapsed. Okay, and we have Shaw working in some top secret projects like ZR Cliff and also something called QK Enchant. And Victor Marchetti has since said that, in his opinion, if Shaw had a high covert security clearance, as it appears that he did, he was not working in DCS, he was probably working in DOD, domestic operations, under Tracy Barnes. And to figure that puzzle out, the documentation on QK Enchant needs to be thoroughly declassified and analyzed. And what makes this even more curious is, it's kind of ironic, we have the documentation on E. Howard Hunt's QK Enchant clearance. That was declassified. And according to those documents, that clearance went all the way up to the Director of Central Intelligence. All right, so I don't understand why we don't have Shaw's documentation on his clearance. Okay, and after we have the documentation, someone has to get more documents explaining what the purpose of this program was. And I wouldn't ask the CIA. All right, staying with Clay Shaw. Shaw was also on the board of a mysterious trade organization called Permindex. And CIA has a file on this in DDP, which is interesting in itself because Directorate of Plans is an operational kind of organization. All right, so I'd like to get that declassified. The present State Department cables on Permindex are incomplete in two senses, in that the State Department documents we have are redacted, and then they stop at 1959, although Permindex continued at least into 1965 in Rome and Johannesburg. And I find it hard to believe they would only have documents when it was in Switzerland. So I'd like to see that extended. All right, also, Army intelligence, who seems to be very kind of reluctant about cooperating with the review board, is supposed to have a file on Permindex, which would make sense since Shaw looks like he was an Army intelligence officer during World War II. So I would ask for both from Army intelligence, that is, the file on Permindex and Shaw's military intelligence file. Only the military file was declassified, to my knowledge. Okay, about Lee Harvey Oswald. I strongly urge the board to interview John Armstrong about some of his new discoveries, about the who and what or whatever Lee Harvey Oswald was, because he's becoming a more and more complex kind of a figure. The FBI seemingly knew about this, and the Bureau attempted to cover up Oswald's espionage role with what looks like a forgery of the films, the photos of the evidence discovered at the Payne household and taken over to the Dallas jail. And John has actual, pretty undeniable evidence that this was the case. And of course, this concerns the mysterious Minox camera. Okay, all the tax records on Lee Harvey Oswald, the ones that he filed in the W-2s, okay, that were supposed to be filed by his employees, have to be collected in one place and analyzed. Armstrong has evidence that the W-2 that was submitted is a false one. It was made up in 1964, which of course is impossible. And the overwhelming evidence that Oswald was an FBI informant is, I think, gotten to a critical mass. So I would suggest that the review board depose James Hosty and Warren DeBreeze. And I would use John Newman's book as a guide to question James Hosty. And I have some interesting letters that Mr. DeBreeze wrote to the FBI when he was being called on to testify by the House Select Committee, which I think the board should see if you don't have them already. He seems to be kind of nervous about a certain set of files that pertain to Lee Harvey Oswald. And DeBreeze is important, and I think he's still alive because I interviewed him in 1994, because he was the FBI's contact with the Cuban exiles in New Orleans, which from other witnesses, if you've heard, is a pretty important connection. He was chosen by Hoover to do the FBI's first examination of the Kennedy assassination. And also, it was DeBreeze who told me that after talking to Marina, it was him who figured out that Oswald shot General Walker, and his logic was that since Oswald shot Kennedy in the head, and the shot at Walker was aimed at his head, they must have been the work of the same man. Okay, every single file on Ruth and Michael Payne has to be located and declassified in its total entirety. And there's a reason why Ruth Payne was asked more questions than anybody else by the Warren Commission. And there's a reason why there is no record of her being interviewed by the House Select Committee. There's evidence that Michael Payne bought a car for Oswald, which he tried to hide the payments on. There's this Minix camera controversy. The Paynes have told differing stories about this Minix camera over time, and they don't coincide with each other. All right, and recently declassified FBI document says there was an Oswald sighting in 1963 in Antioch, Ohio. That's where Ruth Payne attended college. Curiously, the guy who stepped forward and said that wasn't Oswald, it was me, is a guy named Carl Hyde. This man is Ruth Payne's brother. Then there's this mysterious surfacing of the third backyard photograph, supposedly at a meeting between the Morin Show and the Paynes in 1965. And most analysts agree that it's this particular photograph that shows strong evidence that the first two were forgeries. Once every file is declassified on Ruth and Michael Payne, they should be called in for depositions to try and explain these curious events and the the different remarks they have made through time on this case. In the declassified version of the Lopez report, there is a reference in that report to a supposedly complimentary report that was supposed to be contained within it or right next to it. And when I interviewed Eddie Lopez on this point, he thumbed through the report for a few seconds and said, it's not here anymore. In fact, there's even a footnote in the note section of that report that is blanked out. It's not blacked out, it's blanked out, okay? And Eddie said to me, words to the effect, well, if I would have been them, I would have taken it out also. Okay, the title of that report was Oswald an agent of the CIA? Okay, Robert Blakey should be asked about this particular point, since he stayed on after most of the workers left and took part in rewriting the report and some of the volumes. Okay, and Robert Blakey is another guy, I think, who merits doing a deposition with, if for nothing else, his behavior about the Regis Blayhut affair, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, where a CIA liaison was caught with his fingerprints on the autopsy photographs. And I would also like to try and get to the bottom of how Mr. Blakey got this job in the first place. If it turns out to be true that Chris Dodd played a role in this, I think that is significant. The Bay of Pigs first appeared to be a bizarre blunder. Then one author has termed it a perfect failure. And as time goes on, there's pieces of evidence that emerge from the record to indicate that there's elements of subterfuge to help ensure that it was a failure. And there's indications that some of these people that were involved in this deliberate botching of the Bay of Pigs also resurfaced at the time of the Kennedy assassination. So I think it's important that the board gets the top secret internal report on the Bay of Pigs. And I know someone who knows the author of that report, and he's struggling with the CIA right now to get it declassified. And I would urge you to try and subpoena it from him rather than struggle with the CIA over getting it. Okay, relating to that, there's a tape by a suspect who surfaced during the Garrison investigation, and this guy resurfaced during the House Select Committee. Two of this guy's interviews have been declassified. The audio tape itself has not yet been declassified according to my sources. Okay, now this tape is important because it's supposed to have been recorded during a polygraph examination. And during this polygraph examination, he talks about a connecting point between the New Orleans and the Dallas parts of the conspiracy involving such people like Sergio Arcacha Smith. Okay, although that tape was made during the House Select Committee inquiry, the investigator, Lawrence Delsa, actually paid to have the polygraph examiner do it. So you might be able to simplify it since it was not paid for by government funds. Okay, that might be a point of getting it declassified as fast as possible. And in fact, you might want to go back to the polygraph guy himself. He might have a copy of it. All right, there's another tape that is held by a private party. And this is an audio tape of another suspect, Loran Hall. And this was made during the time of the Garrison investigation when Hall was under intense pressure and being actually harassed, and some people say physically harassed, to stop him from talking. At this time, Hall went to this guy and presented him an audio tape, and he said, keep this in case anything happens to me, and then release it to the press if something does. Well, nothing happened to Loran Hall, and this man still has the audio tape, which he says he has never listened to. Okay, so I strongly suggest that you subpoena that and get that in the National Archives. And I hope someday that the board actually does get into the National Security Agency, because I think I would like to see all the files on Walter Sheridan, who was supposed to have been a counterintelligence chief at the NSA and who was a chief obstructionist at the time of the Garrison investigation. The board has the HSCA transcript of the Shah trial, but according to what I've looked at, there are still witnesses' testimony that you don't have, and that's because these were recorded in stenographic notes. The stenographic notes are not part of the record, or else the board has not had them transcribed yet. If you don't have the stenographic notes, then I think you should send Minister Montague down to Miss Helen Dietrich's son down in New Orleans, who probably still has the stenographic notes, and those should become a part of the record. Okay, I don't have to tell the board that Guy Bannister is an important figure in all this intrigue. And there's 2 leads outstanding pertaining to Guy Bannister's files. Okay, one is a man named Alan Campbell, who was a former employee of Guy Bannister, who is still alive and who recently moved from New Orleans to California. His brother Dan Campbell told me that Alan actually has some of the original files removed from Bannister's office at 544 Camp Street. And also Ed Haslam relates that in his book that he was actually shown these files by Ed Butler down in New Orleans when Butler and Alton Oxner Jr. were part of the Contra resupply effort going through New Orleans in the 1980s. So I would strongly suggest that you subpoena both those people to see if they still have any of these files. Dan Campbell told me Alan still has them. And Alan Campbell affirmed this to me in an interview I did with him in 1994. Okay, in a recent memo found in the Garrison files, it's revealed that William Walters, a former employee of the FBI, told Garrison in 1973 that the FBI, through Wackenhut, the Metropolitan Crime Commission, and Aaron Cohn had wiretapped his office.
What was the year again? I'm sorry.
Of the interview was
Yes.
1973.
Thank you.
Okay. And these taps led to the Technical Services Branch of the FBI headquarters in New Orleans. These tapes were transcribed and then sent to Washington. Walters knew this because he had worked there and his wife had actually done the transcribing. Both he and his wife should be subpoenaed to see if they have any physical evidence left of that wiretapping operation, which was probably illegal. Okay, and this relates to the fleeced Justice Department file on Garrison, which, according, again, to my sources in Washington, is about 90% withheld at this time. And it's awaiting a third agency review. And that agency is probably the CIA, since many of the riffs on these classified files show that the FBI liaison person with the Justice Department was James Hunt, who appears to be James Angleton's operations officer. And this is significant because the Justice Department, to put it mildly, offered no help to Garrison at any time, actually monitored and impeded his investigation. And James Angleton seems to be the man at the CIA who, at this time, appears to be running Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay, that file is very important in my opinion, and that should be pretty high on the priority list at this time. Okay, now the equivalent of that file at the CIA would also be important, but the location on this one is kind of more complex. There is a long 1967 CIA memo referring to Garrison's discovery of the Cuban exile training camp at Belle Chase. This camp looks like it was held in trust to the CIA through Schlumberger Tool Company, and this was used to prepare Cuban exiles at the time of the Bay of Pigs invasion. This very detailed memo on this camp could only have come from someone who had intimate knowledge of it at an operational level. And this was written by David Phillips. The routing of this memo goes to 6 places within the CIA. This includes a special counterintelligence file on Jim Garrison. It goes to James Angleton, and it also goes to the infamous Office of Security, headed at that time by Paul Gaynor, the other man in the CIA who had extensive files on Lee Harvey Oswald, and who, according to Jim Hogan, kept a separate file on homosexuals in employ of the CIA. I think that routing sheet and the memo should be studied to see if it can take you to anywhere else within the CIA so you can start looking at these files to see what the CIA had on Garrison. And that becomes important because in the interview that I did with Robert Tanenbaum, he said that he actually saw a memo out of Richard Helms' office that concerned the monitoring and the harassment of Garrison's witnesses at the time of the Clay Shot trial. Okay, besides the names involved and their associations with Oswald and the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee cover-up activity, there's one other reason why I think that those last 2 files really should be looked at and pursued vigorously. And that's because of some notes and records I came across, quite accidentally, that were written by a former employee of the CIA who had some knowledge of these activities firsthand. And I'd like to read an altered and edited version of those notes, and the reasons why I edited and altered it will become clear. I disagree with you on the House Committee report. It is a continuing cover-up of the original Warren Commission cover-up. The parts seeking to neutralize the political motivations for the crime are, of course, ludicrous and contemptuous of the public. Unlike you, I know the report is a cover-up because in the late 1970s, I decided to write up a synopsis of both my role in and knowledge of the conspiracy and the cover-up. I was directly involved in the latter. I prepared this summary when I was debating whether or not to testify before the House Select Committee. The synopsis turned out to be quite a document. In it, I detailed the internal subterfuge involved in the Isle of Pines and Giron Bay parts of the Bay of Pigs operation. This was aided in part by Guy Bannister. That debacle, in turn, set the stage for the conspiracy to kill John F. Kennedy. I went on to list 5 major parts of this elaborate CIA early disinformation plan to ensure the safety of the conspirators. Number 1, the cover-up of Oswald's agent provocateur status. Number 2, the squirreling away of the Castro assassination plots. Number 3, the stage handling of the Mexico City charade with the help of KGB double agent Valery Kostakov. This helped enlist the rest of the government into a cover-up or risk World War III mode. Number 4, Howard Osborne and the Office of Security's successful disguising of Clay Shaw's true agency status from J. Lee Rankin, Jim Garrison, and the House Select Committee. Number 5, the Office of Security's efforts to confuse the public through the secret sponsoring of books like Appointment in Dallas, written by CIA asset Hugh McDonald. The effort to both create and destroy Garrison's hopeless investigation was headed by Osborne along with Helms and Dulles. The point of this was to capture, blunt, and finally wreck the efforts of the critics to reopen a timely reinvestigation. In that sense, a discreditation of Garrison completed the initial cover-up. In the affidavit, I named many of those I worked with operationally in that phase. This included CIA press stringers, both here and abroad, and the FBI agents involved through the Criminal Division of Department of Justice. That particular phase of the cover-up continued with the phony charges against Garrison by DOJ's Gallinghouse. These also originated in the Office of Security. That's one that I myself refused to work on. Although begun by Osborne, Office of Security continued the cover-up through Gambino. This was needed since Bill Colby sacked Osborne during his struggle with James Angleton over Yuri Nosenko and other matters. At this stage, OS shifted to another level, what with the Bass tapes, the Church Committee, and the Schweiker report. This led to the untimely death of William Harvey, since in a last-ditch effort, Angleton had hinted at leaving the plot between Harvey, Osborne, Helms, and Dulles. This would have pierced the elaborate and obfuscatory internal defenses at CIA, whose linchpin is the Nosenko controversy. I also listed what I knew about the actual conspiracy, since it was planned simultaneously with the cover-up, are essentially one and the same. I listed the probable main assassin behind the fence, a CIA mafia contract assassin and former agent of Des Fitzgerald. I listed the weapons used, directionally silenced rifles designed by Mitch Warbell, and the ammunition, which was frangible projectile pellets. Needless to say, what happened to that committee, I decided not to testify. I haven't been able to check out all this. A lot of it does seem true, and could only be written by someone within the CIA. The details were just not available at that time. But that's another reason why I think that those particular files will be useful. And if you can't get anything out of them, I would subpoena the survivors of James Angleton and Paul Gaynor. Okay, one last word, if I can editorialize like some of these other people have before me, even though I was told I was only supposed to get 15 minutes. This review board is really, in my view, the last-ditch hope for ever getting the truth about the Kennedy assassination. And even though a lot of people say it doesn't matter, I think if you examine the record, it does matter. And the reason it matters is very clear from Kevin Phillips' book, Arrogant Capital. In that book, he displays a chart of the increasing cynicism about government. And that chart begins a nosedive in 1964. And Kevin Phillips is no liberal or John F. Kennedy lover, but he's simply an honest man. And he said that nosedive was precipitated by the issuance of the Warren Report. And I tend to agree with that. After the film, JFK brought this terrible state of affairs to public consciousness, you 5 people were then appointed to begin speaking frankly and knowledgeably about what had happened to these files and where they can be located today. Very few people, including myself, think that you'll be able to finish this task. And if that occurs, I believe the attempt to reconstitute this committee must be made. If you don't try and at least half-heartedly or whatever to do so, then I think you're going to lose the moral high ground in this struggle, which I think today that you still have. If you don't take that seriously, then I think that basically this will be another failed investigation. And I understand it's not really an official investigation, but it is an investigation into the total amount of files that are left and some of the validity of the evidence. And since you have the right to depose people on the validity of that evidence, there are some people that should be cross-examined on this point. And this should be out there for the record for the American public to see. And if you decide not to attempt to reconstitute, then I think a really honest final report has to be written in which you actually detail where you tried, where you failed, who you got cooperation from, and who you didn't from. All right? That's the kind of report that Bob Tanenbaum, who's one of the very few heroes in this whole travesty, would have written if he would have been forced out at the end of the House Select Committee instead of at the beginning. Okay, that way, the research community and others who will keep after this long after you're gone, you will be able to make an honest judgment about your work. Okay? But I prefer that you would attempt to at least reconstitute. This country has lost $500 billion through the S&L crisis, through lack of oversight. $180 billion on a war in Vietnam, okay, which would have never happened if proper oversight would have been installed in the first place. Okay, billions more in the secret arming of Iraq, okay, from a lack of oversight. And if we can lose that kind of money, approaching, what, $1 trillion, then we can sure spend the peanuts to reconstitute this committee to finally get some truth, okay, about what happened in 1963. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DiEugenio. We have about a minute or so for questions, if there are any from members of the board.
I have a very brief question, a very direct question with a simple answer. As I have understood your testimony, you indicate that you have sources that have knowledge about documents in the existing governmental system. Would you be willing to share the names of those sources with us?
Do you mean those nameless sources I talked about in Washington? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Peter Villa, who goes to the archives all the time, and Bill Davey.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
We appreciate your testimony today. Our next witness is Mr. David Lifton. Mr. Lifton is the author of Best Evidence, Disguise and Deception in the Assassination of John F. Kennedy. It's a book that focused on the medical evidence in the case, and he's currently working on a book about Lee Harvey Oswald. Welcome, Mr. Lifton.
Chairman Sondheim, members of the review board, I want to thank you for asking me to testify here today. From everything I've observed, the review board is doing excellent work in getting classified documents released to the extent allowed by law. In addition, although I know you are not chartered by Congress to reinvestigate, I suspect that when you close shop, the record will show that you have taken the most significant steps possible to clarify the record 33 years after the event. Although transcripts have not been released, the fact that you have deposed the 3 autopsy doctors and the autopsy photographer constitutes a significant milestone and indicates your seriousness of purpose in attempting to answer unanswered questions while there's still an opportunity to do so. Because in the final analysis, what you believe about the assassination of President Kennedy is really a function of what you believe about the integrity of the autopsy and the body of the president at the time of that autopsy. On a personal level, let me provide an example in another area of what this law has meant to me and would mean to any future researcher or historian who wants to discuss the planning of the Dallas trip and particularly how the motorcade route was selected. Jerry Bruno, who worked closely with JFK, was the political advance man for the Dallas trip. The Warren Commission never interviewed him. Not only didn't they interview him, they didn't appear to know who he was. I have seen one memo in the archives in which one Warren Commission attorney said he'd heard there was a Bruno connected with the planning of the trip. Maybe they should look into that. Well, they never did. Bruno's role was first discussed in the William Manchester book, Death of a President. In 1971, Bruno published his own book, Advanced Man, with Jeff Greenfield, who we regularly see on ABC Evening News. A book in which he spelled out in detail the argument between himself and Governor Connolly and other Texas political players over the Dallas luncheon site, which in turn determined the motorcade route. In 1976, the House Select Committee on Assassinations was created. I went to Washington, D.C., spoke with Belford Lawson, the staff attorney in charge of that area. He, too, had never heard of Bruno and was unaware of the fact that Bruno had written a book. I told him who Bruno was and why he must be called. The document Belford Lawson wrote summarizing my meeting with him is now available. In 1978, Bruno was deposed by the HSCA, but when the HSCA report was released in 1979, the transcript of his testimony was not included in the published documents. In fact, it had been placed under seal for 50 years, which meant it would be available in 2028. 28 years past the millennium. Maybe by that time we'll know whether there's life on Mars. Now, in 1994, as a result of the JFK Act, that transcript is available, and it is immensely important. I'd like you to understand what this law has meant to me in terms of my own time scale. I was 31 years old when I read Bruno's book, 36 years old when I met with HSCA and said, call Bruno, you must call Bruno, 38 years old when he was deposed in a closed-door session, 40 years old when the HSCA report was released, and I found to my chagrin that the Bruno testimony was locked up for 50 years, and then 2 years ago when I was 54, and because of this law, I was finally able to read Bruno's sworn testimony, for which I believe I was somewhat responsible. Future generations will not have to go through that process, pursuing an assassination record for the better part of a lifetime, and I commend the Congress for passing this law and the Review Board for doing their level best to implement it. My main reason for appearing here today is to discuss my imminent transfer to the ARRB of my earliest and most significant interviews of Parkland and Bethesda medical witnesses, an important part of the database for my book, Best Evidence. I'm not here to propound or defend any theories, but rather to lay the groundwork for making available to future generations of researchers substantial portions of the data on which I relied. When I interviewed these doctors and other witnesses starting in '66, I asked questions no one had thought to ask before. For example, what was the length of the tracheotomy incision made in Dallas? The value of these accounts are that these are the earliest answers on record to these new and significant questions. Jumping ahead to 1982, when I had obtained the autopsy photographs made available via an intermediary by a retired Secret Service agent, James Fox, I brought these photographs to Dallas and was the first person to show several of the Dallas medical staff the pictures, basically asking, is this what you saw? The commission never did that, nor did the House Select Committee 13 years later in their investigation. None of the Dallas doctors were ever shown autopsy photographs by any official investigative body. My 1982 and 83 interviews in which I did exactly that are on the list of what I am donating, in addition to the imminent transfer of my audio tape interviews, which I've already agreed to with Mr. Samlock. I'm also willing to provide transcripts of my 1989 and 90 filmed interviews of several of these same doctors, if desired. Turning now to the report of the two agents who attended the autopsy, James Siebert and Francis O'Neill. I interviewed Siebert in early November 1966, questioning him about the statement in his FBI report in which he quotes the head pathologist at Bethesda Autopsy, Commander Humes, as saying that it was, quote, apparent that when the president's body was put on the table, there had been, quote, surgery of the head area, namely in the top of the skull, close quote. Siebert said the statement was true. I tape recorded the conversation. I am donating a reference copy of that tape to the ARRB for transfer to the JFK Records collection. And for those concerned with the taping of telephone conversations, this was 30 years ago, when the laws were quite different, and in any event, all statutes have run, and I might add that I only tape record the FBI in cases of national security. I interviewed Commander Humes, the lead autopsy pathologist, on November 2nd, 1966, and November 3rd, 1966, just days after he had been shown the Kennedy autopsy photographs for the first time. I also questioned him about the surgery statement in the Siebert and O'Neill report. Substantial portions of those conversations are printed in my book. I'm donating high-quality reference copies, computer-enhanced, I might add, to the ARRB for transfer to the JFK Records collection. In 1967, I interviewed Godfrey McHugh, Kennedy's Air Force aide, who attended the autopsy. In attempting to develop a chain of possession on the president's body, something the Warren Commission never did, I interviewed the members of the military casket team, who transported the Dallas coffin from Andrews Air Force Base to Bethesda Naval Hospital. These include General Philip Wheel, the commandant or the commander of the Military District of Washington, as well as all the members of the team which met Air Force One upon his arrival from Dallas, the same squad, as it turned out, who escorted the body to graveside on Monday, November 25th. The members of the casket team include Hubert Clark, the young sailor from New York, James Leroy Felder, the Army Sergeant from South Carolina, Timothy Cheek from the Marines from Ocala, Florida, Coast Guardsman George Barnum from Lake City, Minnesota, and Army Special 4th Class Douglas Mayfield from San Diego. I even interviewed Lieutenant Byrd, the Army captain whose memory was largely lost by 1967 when he took a bullet in the head in Vietnam, and who I was able to speak with when a nurse brought a telephone to his bedside at the hospital where he was recuperating from his near-fatal wounds. What hospital? John F. Kennedy Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. None of these men were interviewed by the Commission. Moreover, I am also contributing my copy of Coast Guardsman George Barnum's written report, made in December '63, an account of which has many valuable details, and one that was written because a relative of his who had a distant connection with the Lincoln assassination from a previous generation or two, told young George, write everything down, it may be important someday. Well, it is. Finally, I have brought with me today a very special copy of the Zapruder film of President Kennedy's assassination, and this relates somewhat to what Attorney Belin was referring to earlier. As everyone knows, the original was an 8mm positive. Copies of that film were immediately made for the FBI and the Secret Service, and within days, Zapruder sold the original to Time Life. Although it was reported at the time that he obtained $25,000 for his film, in fact, the contract, which I provided ARRB, shows he was paid $150,000, and that would be about $500,000 today. I disagree with Belin, who said it would be $1 million. I had a banker compute this. But that's one of the many things we probably would disagree on, is the rate of inflation since 1963. The payments were made in a series of 6 $25,000 payments that occurred shortly after the first of each year through 1968. Despite the substantial price paid for the film, for all rights, it was not exploited by Time Life as a motion picture film, i.e., it was never shown on TV or sold in any documentary form as a moving picture. No newsreels, no TV specials, nothing. Yet one of the most controversial aspects of the film, one never addressed by the Warren Commission, was the violent backward motion of the head depicted on the frames following the fatal shot. What this means has been debated back and forth over the years. Passions run high on both sides. For reasons I never understand, the Warren Commission failed to address the issue. In other words, if we are to believe the record, the Warren Commission apparently didn't notice the very thing which has fueled the assassination debate for 3 decades. And of course, the public didn't even know it was an issue because Time Life chose not to show it as a motion picture film after paying $150,000 for those exclusive rights. I might add, Professor Liebler appeared this morning and put the B.K. Jones report, the fellow from UCLA, on the table here. He's contributing him. Thank you very much, Professor Liebler. We already have that in the archives. That was contributed 15 or 20 years ago with the Rockefeller Commission, when that was already submitted to try to explain the backward snap of the head. But anyway, it's being resubmitted, and I suppose there's no real danger in recycling that sort of thing. The film is important for another reason. Because Zapruder was filming through a telephoto lens, some of the frames show the wounds, and so the film constitutes an unusual photographic record of the president's wounds in Dallas. In order to do any work with the Zapruder film, whether about the wounds or about the motions shown, the velocity of the car, etc., the clearest possible copy is required. In commercial production applications, a device known as an optical printer is normally used to copy motion picture film, frame by frame, particularly if blow-ups are to be made. But optical printers are not designed to accept home movies, which are in 8mm format. In 1967, Life sent the film to Manhattan Effects, later called EFX, a New York City film lab, where film technician Moses Weitzman designed a device permitting a high-quality, fully commercial optical printer to accept an 8mm home movie film. Then, in one fell swoop, he enlarged the Zapruder film from 8mm to 35mm format, the kind used in standard motion picture work. The result is stunning, as anyone knows who has seen the movie JFK or who has purchased a Laserdisc copy of that film. One reason for the clarity was that Weitzman used a liquid gate, or a wet gate as it's called, which permits a liquid of the same index of refraction as the emulsion of the film to come in contact with the frame when it is imaged. The result is that scratches are eliminated or greatly reduced in the copy. The very best of these 35mm negatives and interpositors were given to the customer, Time Life, and I would hope the review board would attempt to locate these with all resources you have available to you. They are a priceless record of our history, but with regard to the 35mm negatives known as technician copies, which Weitzman kept in his lab, these he gave to another researcher, and they remain, as they always have been, completely unavailable to the research community. But in 1990, before that transfer took place, I had the opportunity to work with one of these 35mm negatives, the best of the lot, I'm told. one which had been loaned to the producer of the TV show Nova by Weitzman. First, I supervised making high-quality timed liquid gate contact interpositives. Then, using funds provided by several researchers, and this project cost between $10,000 and $15,000, I rented the services of an optical lab in New York. And for about a week, I worked at the optical printer, taking the next step that would be necessary by any archivist in order to preserve the record and create a progenitor for all future 35mm prints. Operating the printer myself, I also made high-quality liquid gate interpositives from the 35mm negative. Then I made interpositive blow-up sequences directly from that same 35mm intraneg, some focusing on Kennedy, some on Connolly, some on the two Secret Service agents in the front of the car. I'm holding here one of those 35mm interpositives. It's a timed liquid gate contact interpositive, which I am today donating to the ARRB for placement in the JFK Records collection. From this archival item, this 35mm interpositive, it should be possible to make many negative-positive pairs. That is, this 35mm interpositive can be the progenitor of many 35mm internegatives, and they in turn can be used to create 35mm positives, whether they be slides or motion picture film. Although I defer to Moses Weitzman, you can call this item the Lifton interpositive, made from the Weitzman internegative. I cannot overemphasize the high quality of the original Weitzman internegative. One researcher who has worked in this area tells me that although he has bought rights for the film from the Zapruder family, when it comes to actually using pictures for his book, the negative from this interpositive produces positive images that are clearer than he can obtain from the corresponding source item at the National Archives. It does not surprise me that this is the case because Weitzman is a fine technical person, and the internegative he made, which was done in 1967, is certainly equal and probably better than anything made by Life for the FBI or Secret Service back in 63 and 64, and maybe better than anything we made today in 1996, depending upon what has happened to the original film over the intervening decades. With regard to this item, I am donating this negative to the ARRB without any copyright claim whatsoever. This copy has one limitation. The left-hand 20%, the images between the sprocket hole, is not visible, precisely because it was copied on a standard commercial optical printer. Which brings me to my final point. I would like to ask the Zapruder family, i.e. the LMH company, to donate the original Zapruder film to the JFK collection in the National Archives. As mentioned before, they were paid $150,000 from 1963 through 1968, plus the contract indicates additional monies from foreign and other sales. Then, about 1975, Life sold the film back to Zapruder for $1. Then the process started again. The film remained in control of the Zapruder family. Tens of thousands of dollars have been flowing to the Zapruder family every time a significant Kennedy assassination anniversary rolls around, every time any producer or network or broadcast entity wants to do a film on this subject. To the Zapruder family, I ask, when is enough enough? I have been in too many situations where people, serious researchers or producers, could not use this film because they could not afford it. I myself could not use the Zapruder film in the Best Evidence Research video, a serious video dealing with issues pertaining to the autopsy and distributed nationally by Rhino Video via MCA, because of the extraordinary $1 per cassette charge that Henry Zapruder, Abe's son, told me sounded about right for a royalty. And so we used a diagram instead. And so I say to the Zapruder family, donate this film to the National Archives, not a copy, but the original. It is the Rosetta Stone for this case, and the issue now is authenticity. If the film has not been tampered with, then it is an accurate record of the wounds, and it is a time clock of the assassination. However, and more importantly, if the film has been tampered with in some way, as many have alleged, and I might add, as I believe, then that matter must be investigated in the future. In short, it represents an assassination record that has to be clarified, and that cannot be done properly by examining a copy. This is the week to do it, Mr. Zapruder. Inscribe yourself in the Book of Life forever. Donate your father's film to the JFK collection at the National Archives. Remove all copyright constraints. It is the right thing to do. I'm now handing over a list of audio interviews I intend to be donating to the archives, plus this film. Again, I want to thank the Review Board for the work they are doing. I think few people in the public realize the enormous number of documents involved or the complications involved in organizing such a huge database and clearing it for release. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lifton.
Do you have any questions?
Thank you so much for the donations. They're very significant and I think will be very helpful to the interests of the American public. Any questions for Mr. Lifton? Very well. Thank you very much. Our last witness today is Mr. Steve Tilley from the National Archives. Before I ask Mr. Tilley to come forward,
Yes.
If we ran out of time earlier in the hearing when Eric Hamburg was up, and I wonder, Mr. Hamburg, if you'd be willing to come back up. There's several members who have a couple of brief questions for you before we turn to Mr. Tilley. Thank you again for your very helpful testimony this morning, and Dr. Hall.
Yeah, Mr. Hamburg, thank you very much. I have two questions, and I'm going to state them succinctly as I can in the hope that you will respond with equal directness in view of the hour. First, I'm wondering, especially in light of the testimony that we've heard this morning and the substantial disagreement I think that exists about what occurred in the assassination and the role and significance of the movie JFK, whether you or Oliver Stone or Warner Brothers would be willing to share as part of the collection of material that would go into the National Archives those items that pertain to the conclusions you reached in the film itself.
Well, let me just set the record straight on one point. I cannot claim any credit for the film JFK. I wish I could. I personally think it was a great film, but I was in Washington at that time. I was working on Congressman Hamilton's staff. I was not a producer on JFK, although I was on Nixon. So I can't really speak for the, making of that film. I could certainly convey the request to Oliver. I'm not sure specifically, but whatever materials would be relevant to you that he could provide or that we could provide, I'm sure we would be happy to do that. I don't really want to rehash the whole debate over JFK. I think that's been done ad infinitum. I mean, I think, as we would say in Washington, I'm going to put Mr. Belin down as undecided and just leave it at that.
Well,
he has a right to his opinion, and
my goal here is not to rehash it either, and I think the board's goal isn't that as well. But the film does, I think, serve an important purpose in the public debate, and it would be interesting to have whatever materials figure in the reconstruction of the historical events that it depicts, the kind of sources and the kind of information that were used in the film. It might be an appropriate part of the JFK collection.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think that as far as the Garrison material, Zach Sklar, who was the co-author of the screenplay, had a lot of it because he had been the editor on Garrison's book, On the Trail of the Assassins. That was how he came into the process, and he co-wrote the screenplay, and he had a lot of the Garrison files, which I believe he has donated to the AARC in Washington. He may still have some, and we may have some materials. There was a lot of research that went into that film. I mean, I will say this, there was a book published, Dr. Nelson was talking about the value of annotated manuscripts, and an annotated version of the script was published, which contained all the sources that were used, that were drawn upon. I think Oliver has made the point many times, there was nothing really new in that film. It was all drawing on the work that had been done by other researchers and investigators.
Well, there is, I think, kind of an interesting set of issues related to how one comes to make these conclusions and then transmits them more generally. And of course, for those of us who have seen the movie Nixon, there are similar assertions that are made in somewhat, strikes me, vaguer tones with a disclaimer at the end.
Well, we did also publish an annotated version of the Nixon script. I did edit that book. It's been published. It's available. In fact, I gave a copy to Mr. Samaluk. And, we, again, did a lot of research, drew on a lot of sources, not all of which agree with each other. And, I would leave it to the historians to draw the final conclusions. I mean, we've had an exchange, as you know, Dr. Nelson, she had published a piece criticizing Oliver, criticizing our film, and we responded. And
It's not quite. Not quite.
Well, let me just say this. I think there's considerable evidence for the proposition that Nixon knew about the plots against Castro, was involved in them. We drew on the work of Michael Beschloss, Arthur Schlesinger, Fawn Brody, and John Newman, among others, who are very reputable historians. Now, there may be other historians who disagree, and that's fine. I do think, though, that members of the board should be a little bit careful in expressing an opinion on issues which are relevant to the matters under review by this board. I think that can lead to an appearance that there's a lack of objectivity, which I think can be very damaging to the credibility of the board, potentially.
Right.
I think Mr. Tanenbaum knows as a federal judge that if you were sitting on a case and you published an article on expressing opinion on the merits of the case that was under review, you would probably be recused from that case. So I just think, just for the sake of objectivity, it's important to be very careful about that.
Mr. Hamburg, my article, which was in the Chronicle of Higher Education, had to do with access to the Nixon documents. And I believe my point was that this was an example of what happens when you don't release documents. So it was not a direct, it had nothing to do with the JFK film. It had to do with the Nixon film,
Right.
and actually had to do with what we are now doing, that is to say, releasing documents.
Yeah, no, I agree with your basic point that
I
the Nixon...
didn't want to mislead the audience here.
Yeah,
I
well,
haven't written anything about that.
we wrote a letter responding.
Yes,
I think there were
of course,
some
that was
opinions
fine.
expressed in that piece, but, I agree with that basic point. I would say on that point that Nixon, in his own memoirs, said that he was never able to get from the CIA all of the files that he had requested pertaining to Cuba and the Bay of Pigs and so on. This is in his own memoirs, and we've cited that in our book, but I think it's important to seek those files because, as we've pointed out, it was his own Chief of Staff, Haldeman, who expressed the opinion that the Bay of Pigs thing was Nixon's code word for the Kennedy assassination. And there are references on the White House tapes, particularly June 20th and 23rd of 72, to that matter. And so, I think it would be worth trying to get from the CIA those files which Nixon himself, as president, was unable to obtain from the CIA.
Again, in the interest of time, I wonder if I might pose a second question to you. Your testimony, both written and oral, has indicated that you believe the Cuban government would be receptive to the board meeting with it with regard to materials that they hold, ranging across the spectrum of activities, including perhaps the operations of their own internal security officials, which would, of course, be interesting indeed. Can you tell me on what basis you reached that conclusion?
Well, as I say, I spent considerable time there. I was, and I'm not an official government person, although I had worked on this legislation and worked in the Congress, but I personally met with Fidel Castro, with a number of his top officials and advisors, and I spent many, many hours and days with General Escalante, who was in charge of their investigation, and I think they're very eager to present this information, but I think they are looking for
the Cuban government hasn't said to you, geez, why don't you come tell the review board that we would be delighted to speak with them on this matter?
No, they haven't said that specifically, but they did complain to me, for example, that the Warren Commission, did not do enough to request information which they had within their purview, and I think also the House Select Committee didn't really go as far as they could have with this. But I'm just expressing my opinion. I think that Mr. Gunn of your staff has actually met General Escalante at a conference in Nassau. I wasn't able to get to that conference, but I'm just saying they have a lot of files. What he's told me is basically these files go back to the period of 60 to 63, and they are not computerized or, they have to go back and dig these things out. But they have voluminous files. They had a lot of informants in the Cuban community in Miami, New Orleans, and Dallas, and elsewhere. And they have a lot of files which basically are relevant to this matter, which I think if an official request were made, they would certainly be receptive. Castro himself has made statements that he would make these available if they were requested.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hamburg. Mr. Steve Tilley. Mr. Tilley has been, from the beginning, the Review Board's liaison at the National Archives. He is the caretaker of the JFK collection, and he's going to provide for the Review Board an update on the contents of the collection. And in the past, that's provided very helpful information for the board. Welcome, Steve, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Oh, it's a pleasure to appear before the board. The President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992 gave 7 specific responsibilities to the National Archives, but for the purposes of today's discussion, I will touch on the 3 that are most important for the research public. First, within 45 days of the statute being signed, the Archives was required to prepare and make available standard identification forms for use by all government offices in describing assassination records. Furthermore, the Archives was required to ensure the creation of a database for identification forms to serve as an electronic finding aid to the collection. Now, this database has been available since the collection opened for research in August of 1993. It currently contains over 175,000 identification forms, and as of last February is available for research via the Internet. I have some blue bookmarks which we have published at the Archives, and we've had them available out on the table, and this gives the Internet address for the collection for those who want to research it via the Internet. I want to emphasize that the database does not contain the actual text of documents. The database consists of the record identification forms created by each agency as the documents were reviewed. Secondly, the database has not been updated to reflect decisions made by the Review Board and other changes in the status of some documents. The National Archives is currently working on that issue, and we hope to be able to start updating the database within a few months. Our second responsibility was to establish the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection. On December the 28th, 1992, the National Archives established the collection by an announcement published in the Federal Register on December the 21st of that year. This announcement also solicited open assassination records from all federal offices for inclusion in the collection. As established on that date, the collection consisted of open records already in the custody of the National Archives, including the Warren Commission, the Secret Service, the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice, a portion of the CIA's 201 personality file on Lee Harvey Oswald, and donated records from several presidential libraries. Our third responsibility, which we shared with other government offices, was to identify, review, and make available to the public all assassination records that could be disclosed under the provisions of the law within a 300-day review period. All records reviewed during this period were required to be entered into the database and have a record identification form attached. At the end of the review period, the newly released records were made available, including the remainder of Oswald's 201 file, the first portions of the CIA's segregated collection of related assassination records, the records of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and records of several DOJ components, although none from the FBI. The first records of the FBI were transferred in December of 1993, beginning with the headquarters and field office files on Jack Ruby. Since then, the FBI has transferred records relating to Lee Harvey Oswald, Marina Oswald, David Ferry, Clay Shaw, Sam Giancana, Marita Lorenz, Carlos Marcelo, Santos Traficante, and many other individuals and subjects. We are scheduled to receive approximately 40 additional boxes of FBI records on this Friday of this week. My understanding is that those records particularly apply to Johnny Rosselli, and additional files at the FBI are also under review. The CIA made additional transfers of records in September and December of 1994, providing the remaining portions of the segregated collection. The records transferred in September related primarily to the CIA's work with Cuban exile groups in the early 1960s, while the latter transfer consisted of the notes taken by HSCA staff members during its review of CIA documents. I must point out, however, that only a portion of the Oswald 201 file and the notes of the HSCA staff members can be searched in the database. The CIA has run into difficulty with their program for creating data disks, and we are waiting for the transfer of the remainder of these data disks for their records. The collection includes the assassination-related records of the Church and Pike committees. While we have 41 boxes of Church Committee records, a review of the committee's published report and certain committee documents indicates that there are additional assassination-related records still in the custody of the Senate, Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. There have been contacts with the staff of the committee to pursue this issue. The data disks for the records already are in our custody, having been recently transferred, and we plan to add them to the database shortly. We have recently identified assassination records among the records of several congressional committees already in our custody. The records of the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee contain transcripts of executive session testimony and other documents relating to Ruth Payne, General Edwin Walker, and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. The records of the House Un-American Activities Committee contain a variety of files on several individuals, along with files on the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. The records of the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in the Labor or Management field, known as the McClellan Committee, may contain assassination records. The index of these records remains in the custody of the Senate Committee on Government Operations, but a sampling of entries under Carlos Marcello and Santos Traficante produced references that indicate the probability of assassination-related documents among the records of the committee. Finally, the records of the Subcommittee on Government Information and Individual Rights of the House Committee on Government Operations, known as the ABSUG Committee, contain documentation concerning access to the records of the Warren Commission and the Kennedy autopsy materials. We're working with the staffs of the various committees to add these relevant records to the collection. In the last year, there have been some significant additions to the collection. In 1995, the Secret Service turned over the shift reports of the agents protecting the president for November 1963. Earlier this year, the service released records from the files of Chief James Rowley, plus documents relating to the organization of the service for the years 1961 and 62. In October 95, the State Department released additional documents from the Passport Office. In April of this year, NARA received 1 cubic foot, approximately 2,500 pages, of records of the Rockefeller Commission and the staff of the Ford White House from the Ford Library. These documents were released as the result of a review of the records of the Rockefeller Commission and the Ford White House staff by a CIA team which spent a week at the library. The remaining records of the Commission are still under review by the CIA and other agencies. NARA has also required records donated by individuals under deeds of gift. The papers of Jim Garrison and Edward Wegman were donated to the collection after the public hearing in New Orleans. In July of this year, a motion picture film taken in Dallas on November the 22nd, 1963, was donated by Janet Vesey and Helen Sturgis Anderson. A great deal of material remains under review by various agencies. The FBI continues to review related documents, and the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice is currently reviewing the previously withheld portions of that office's main file on the assassination. We have yet to receive any records from the Immigration and Naturalization Service. The Postal Service indicated last year they were almost ready to transfer a file on the investigation of the sale of Oswald's rifle through the mail, but we have not received that file at this time. Various components of the Department of Defense continue to locate and review documents related to the assassination. For example, we recently located at NARA the files of the Secretary of the Army related to Operation Mongoose. While these records were legally transferred to NARA in 1995, when the Kennedy Act was signed into law in 1992, these records were in the custody of the Department of the Army, but were not located. A team of CIA and other agency reviewers recently visited the Kennedy Library in Boston to review the national security files related to Cuba and other related topics. We hope to receive the results of this review in the near future. And if I may ask, there are a couple questions that were raised previously in the hearing, Mr. Chairman. First of all executive session transcripts of the Warren Commission are now released and available. And also, at this time, all documents created by the staff of the Warren Commission are available for research with no redactions. The remaining records of the Warren Commission that are closed were all created by other agencies, and some of them are still going through that third agency review process. And I'm willing to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Tilley. Are there questions for Mr. Tilley?
How many documents would you say are now there to be plowed through?
It's hard to say.
Couple million?
A couple million. A couple million, yeah. We probably have more than 175,000 records in the database as we continue to add things. But of course, the database only reflects the documents that were reviewed since this passing of the statute. It doesn't reflect those documents which were open, which was a considerable amount of material. So we have a great number of documents available.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you for your continued help. It's been a very interesting and provocative hearing this morning with testimony. I think the review board has certainly heard very good advice from quite a number of people. I do want to particularly thank James Rankin, Wesley Liebler, and David Lifton for their donations of records and physical material. That information will be very helpful to the American public. We are going to hold the record open from this hearing for a period of time in case there is additional testimony that anyone wishes to submit. What day will it be?
October 11th.
Be open until October 11th. So any additional testimony the board would be very pleased to accept. There being no further business to come before the Assassination Records Review Board today, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It's carried. This meeting of public hearing of the Assassination Records Review Board is adjourned.